or you can put your questions into the chat. And I hope that you do have questions, and even though this is an online training, can kind of engage with our presenters and ask the questions that you have about the content for today. So other than that, there was an agenda included in your email that has the outline for today. There's two 15-minute breaks and an hour break in the middle of the day for lunch. So definitely you have those scheduled breaks, and obviously if you need to take a break outside of that, take a break. It's all good. All right, and so with that, I'm going to be presenting this morning on sort of the why and the how we're here, what's the problem that we're trying to solve, talk about some really common shoreland best management practices that include sort of both shoreland and sort of some stormwater BMPs. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what is the problem? Why are we here today? There are 800 lakes and ponds in Vermont, and 220 of those are over 20 acres in size. And each one of those lakes has a watershed around it. Lakes and ponds are sort of the low point in the landscape. They're the basin where all of the water from the watershed ends up. And many of the activities that we do on the land in the watershed, despite sometimes being miles away from a lake or pond, can end up delivering pollution into the lake. Because we know this, all kinds of regulations and voluntary activities take place within our watersheds that are geared towards protecting our lakes and ponds. And then we also know that shoreland habitat in its natural state is a really excellent filter for stormwater, filtering water, infiltrating into the ground to stop the water, remove the nutrients before it enters the water body. And we know what we do on the direct shoreland as well as up in the headwaters in the watershed makes a big difference for the water quality of lakes and ponds. So we know that Vermont's lake shores are threatened by developmental density and poor stormwater practices. 13% of Vermonters live within 250 feet of a lakeshore, and compared with our more densely populated urban areas, the population density is actually more residences per square mile around our lake shores than someplace like Burlington. We also know that shoreline alteration is a higher indicator of biodiversity distress than either eutrophication or acidification in our northeastern lakes. So we know that in Vermont, there is a problem of development around our lake shores, how densely we developed them, and how much of our natural shoreline we've removed. So many of the shoreline BMPs are going to focus on creating and maintaining a living shoreline. That living shoreline includes the terrestrial part of the shore that you see here, on the upland, the larger trees and shrubs, and also the littoral zone. And the littoral zone is the area of the shoreline where the light is still penetrating to the bottom and often has an abundance of aquatic plants. The littoral zone is known as the nursery ground of the lake and is critical habitat for many aquatic animal species. So living shorelands are going to have tons of benefits, including wildlife habitat, stable banks to protect property, and they also protect water quality. Here is a model example. So in Vermont, we know that there are two major types of lake shores. There's wetland lake shores and forested lake shores. And forested lake shores make up the majority of our lakeshore habitat in the state. And, you know, all of Vermont's diversity of aquatic and terrestrial species have really evolved to be interacting with that kind of a complex habitat structure that exists along shorelines. And while there is diversity of structure and habitat in forested shorelines, there are some things that are pretty consistent throughout forested shorelines that those organisms are going to be depending on. And those are things like shading, leaf litter, woody structure from small sticks to whole fallen trees. And it also provides a source of nutrient enrichment. So we're going to be talking about phosphorus a lot today, and phosphorus pollution, phosphorus loading. And while phosphorus in abundance can be a bad thing for these systems, there is a level of phosphorus into our lakes that is a natural concentration, and we're only talking about the excess of that being bad. So a natural lakeshore does still add some phosphorus into the lake, but at much lower and more natural levels. So this is a model of a forested lakeshore on an undeveloped parcel, and you can see it models the amount of runoff, the amount of phosphorus, and the amount of sediment. And we've got 1,000 cubic feet of runoff, 0.03 pounds of phosphorus, and 5 pounds of sediment into the lake from this undeveloped parcel. And when we change that model to look at a developed parcel, it looks much more like this. So when you contrast these, you can see that the developed site has no trees, it's covered by lawn and impervious surface that is going to be delivering water and sediment and nutrients straight to the littoral zone. And the developed site delivers 5 times more runoff, 7 times more phosphorus, and 18 times the amount of sediment into that shallow water lake area. So you can see living shorelines provide multiple benefits to all, and few would prefer poorer fishing, fewer loons, and more algae blooms in their lake. However, as much as people value wildlife and clean water, they also tend to remove native vegetation, which is the most important shoreline component for wildlife, water quality, and property protection. Um, so these are some pictures of sort of traditional shoreline development on Vermont lakes. And a lot of Vermont lakes were developed pretty heavily prior to 2014. And a lot of this development that you see here is uh, is very common to that pre-2014 development on lake shores where the development is really close to the shoreline. There's very little vegetation, and there's some pretty poor stormwater practices. So what happened in 2014? Vermont passed the Shoreline Protection Act, which began to regulate some of this development and curtail some of the worst parts of this development. And there's a whole presentation coming up later today going into the Shoreline Protection Act and the details of that. But I do just want to note that many other Northeast states, like Maine is a really good example, put regulations around shoreline development earlier on. So Maine did that back in the 70s. And because of that early adoption of shoreline regulations, they're in a much better spot than Vermont is now when it comes to lakeshore disturbance. So why are we using best management practices in shoreline? Just to recap everything I just said. They provide bank stability, they protect water quality, they can provide wildlife habitat, and they are going to restore and protect living shorelines. So what are these lake-friendly practices? Here's a cool graphic that shows lots of different kinds of ways that you can improve a property to be more lake-friendly. But in general, we're looking at practices that are going to allow stormwater to slow down and infiltrate before it reaches the water, practices that are going to hold down banks and stop erosion, and practices that are going to create habitat that's both terrestrial and in that littoral zone in the water, which would include like shade that's created by trees and bushes, emergent vegetation, fallen snags, branches, rocks, etc. So we're really looking in general just to create more natural, less suburban lakeshore properties. So a lot of you today are probably pretty familiar with conventional or gray stormwater infrastructure. This is usually a hardscaped infrastructure commonly found in urban areas or town settings, but other places as well. And that would include drains, catch basins, pipes, storm sewers, ditches, culverts, things like that. And then there are green stormwater infrastructure uh, projects that are engineered practices that mimic natural hydrological features for infiltration, filtration, and conveyance. And they also provide some ecosystem services for flood control, water purification, habitat, etc. These are some more examples of green stormwater infrastructure. Some of these are more suited to urban areas like stormwater tree pits and green roofs, while things like pervious pavers we do see on some lakeshore properties. And so these often aren't suitable for a more rural lakeshore property, except with a caveat of the pervious pavers. So the green stormwater infrastructure that we're really looking at for shorelines and shoreland properties are usually a more low-tech, vegetated shoreland best management practice that's going to protect water quality, wildlife, and bank stability. You're going to see a theme throughout my presentation and really throughout the entire day. We're going to talk a lot about natural vegetation over and over again. So you can see some examples of a renaturalized shoreline down at the bottom and a sort of mock-up there at the top. Really quickly, I'm going to put in this shameless plug for another program that I run, which is called the Lakewise program. Lakewise is the non-regulatory sister program to the Shoreland Protection Act. It was started in 2013, just before the law was put into effect. Lakewise is an initiative of the Agency of Natural Resources, and it offers free stormwater management and erosion assessments, which include technical assistance to lakeshore landowners with the goal of establishing a culture of lakeshore land management that can improve stormwater practices and therefore water quality over time. The program assesses properties in four categories: driveways, structures and septic, recreation areas, and shoreline, and then makes these kinds of BMP recommendations to landowners to improve stormwater management. And I've sort of structured the second half of this presentation kind of around those four areas. There's a lot more to say about the Lakewise program, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone who's here today is aware of it. And so if you either have shoreline property, know someone who has shoreline property, or you're working with someone who has shoreline property and they haven't had a Lakewise assessment, these are free, non-regulatory assessments that can be a really helpful starting place for people to figure out some of their stormwater issues. So now you all know. So we're going to talk about our shoreland BMPs. And there are two main types. There are vegetative BMPs that are going to infiltrate, filter, and benefit wildlife. And then there are some of those structural BMPs that are just going to infiltrate and filter water, but don't necessarily have that wildlife habitat benefit. And we're going to talk about driveways first. So more and more, we're talking about driveways as well as private roads, and then even town roads and state highways, because they can all be big contributors to runoff issues and water quality problems in Vermont lakes. Many roads are built right along the edges of lake shores, including some larger town and state highways. An example of that I always think of is Route 5A, right along the eastern shore of Lake Willoughby. It's an iconic view. It's a beautiful drive, but man, is that road close to the lake. And there are issues that roads along lake shores have that can be addressed through some bioengineering practices, which we will be talking about later today. That's for sort of bigger roads that are, falling into the lake, let's say. But for right now, let's talk about our smaller roads, our private roads and driveways. So many of the lake watershed assessments that we've been doing over the past few years have shown that runoff from private roads and driveways is actually contributing a large percentage of phosphorus into some of Vermont's lakes. And private roads are often maintained by a small road association, maybe a single landowner, or in some cases, really like no one at all. The roads just haven't been maintained. And this sort of deferred maintenance and under maintenance of roads and driveways can lead to runoff, channelization, erosion, and that was definitely exacerbated in some areas of Vermont the last few years by the intense storms and flooding that we've had. Driveways are similar in that sometimes they're not very well maintained, particularly on smaller camps and seasonal camps. And in a lot of cases, those driveways were built to head straight down the hill towards a lake. So they're really just acting as like a chute for water. Um, and so the first step is always to have roads and driveways properly maintained, graded, crowned, and avoiding grader berms when regrading is also essential for water to be able to flow off the sides of the roads instead of straight down roads and driveways. So good maintenance is first. After that, we're looking to divert water off of roads and driveways into more vegetated areas. So in these pictures, you can see some examples of open top culverts. They're a structural BMP that intercepts runoff and redirects it either to a vegetated area or a rock apron where it can be filtered and infiltrate into the ground. These photos are of the Lake Eden Fish and Wildlife Access Area. They were put in a few summers ago. They do require some maintenance. They do have to be cleaned out periodically because sediment can fill them up. But they do work pretty well to divert water off of roads and driveways. And it's also important to just remember that it's really not the volume of water that is crossing the driveway that is causing the erosion. It's the velocity at which that water travels. So being able to intercept it and slow it down is really important, slowing it down and redirecting it. We also encourage vegetation around parking areas to both define the parking area and to act as another sink for water that may be coming off a road or a parking area. And finally, culverts. I think we all know that culverts are a huge problem throughout our state and many other states, in that they're often old, they're not maintained well, or they're not properly sized for the amount of water, or the amount of water has changed since they were properly sized. And so I'm not going to get into a whole spiel about culverts because it could take the rest of this morning. But it is just important to be looking at culverts and checking them out and telling landowners maybe to maintain those a little better if they're on their property and make sure that they get cleaned out regularly. Looking at structures, what we're really looking at here is, how much of the property is impervious and where is the water going once it hits that impervious surface. So often it's a roof, but it could be a deck or a patio, a garage roof, sheds, parking areas. And in this photo, you can see there's a gutter downspout that is pouring onto the ground right in front of the foundation of this structure. There's nothing to infiltrate it. It's creating a muddy mess. It's pooling water right on the foundation of the house, which is a bad idea. And so this is unfortunately not all of that uncommon. So what are the things that we can do to better infiltrate water that's coming off of rooftops? Two common options for this are a drip line trench around the house. So that's dug out. Often there's a pervious pipe on the inside, unless there's really infiltrative soils. And that's going to catch the water from the roof and let it sink into the ground rather than running over the lawn. If a structure does have gutters, you can have the downspout directed into a vegetated area or into a dry well, like the picture on the right there. And these are both good ways to deal with that water coming off of the roof. Um, so this is a rain garden with an awful lot of problems. So as you can see, this rain garden has standing water in it, which is a sign that it is not absorbing and infiltrating the water that's coming into it. This is a very undersized rain garden for what it is. It's also incredibly close to the house. You really don't want to have a rain garden, up against your house, up against your foundation. And this one is way too small. So most BMPs try to design them for a 1 inch rainfall because 90% of our storms are 1 inch or less for now. And we can calculate based on the square footage of the impervious surface how much volume of stormwater is going to run off. So rain gardens are an example for this, but lots of stormwater BMPs are sized this way. And then you can figure out the treatment volume from the rainfall and the impervious surface amount. So for example, 1,000 square feet of impervious surface, which might be the roof runoff into this gutter, based on a 1 inch rainstorm would generate 620 gallons of water. So that's how much you're trying to account for with your BMP. So this is a drawing of a much better situated rain garden that has a swale on one side delivering water from the downspout through the swale and into the rain garden, and on the other side is showing an underground pipe from a downspout to the rain garden. The rain garden is much larger. It's further away from the house. It's actually downhill from the house in a depression, and is designed to hold much more water. These are some photos of some lovely rain gardens at Lake Carmi that look just like beautiful perennial gardens. And I think landowners are much more interested in things that are going to look like this than sort of a stone-lined swale or something like that. They have a lot of curb appeal. So there are two tools I'm going to suggest for sizing BMPs. One is the Vermont Rain Garden Manual. That is a UVMC grant, Vermont Rain Garden Manual, and it's available online and it has lots of information on calculating sizes based on drainage area, soil type, and slope. And also includes lots of information about native plants that can be used and includes some planting templates. And my presentation has a link in the notes of it, and this will be available online for any of you to download and use after the presentations today. And the second tool I'm going to suggest is the Vermont Green Stormwater Infrastructure Simplified Sizing Tool for Small Projects, which is a very succinct name. And this is another online sizing tool for small BMP projects that I would suggest looking into as well. I am not a septic engineer or a person who knows much about septic, but I would be remiss if I didn't say something about septic systems because these come up when talking to lakeshore property owners all of the time. So often lakeside lots are extremely small and there may not be space for a traditional system or to replace a traditional system. And some of these camps, the septic systems are pretty old. So in cases, those kinds of cases, we have to consider what kind of alternative strategies to deal with septic issues are available. So for example, this is a raised sand filter that can be used in tight spaces. I've seen these on properties and some of them are actually quite pretty. This one is fine. But I've seen them like painted fun colors, or with plants around them. They can be very attractive. Um, and this is a PVC lined or concrete box that's filled with sand. The effluent is pumped under low pressure through the pipes in controlled doses to ensure uniform distribution. The effluent leaves the pipes, trickles down through the gravel, and is treated as it filters through the sand. So that's one alternative for a small space or a space where something underground is maybe not feasible. Another type of minimal disturbance would be a minimal disturbance system like this. Those kinds of drip line technologies can work on slopes where other alternatives are not feasible. And in these systems, wastewater is time dosed into the drip irrigation distribution system after it's filtered. And these systems can be installed fairly shallowly at about 6 inches deep. And they can also be installed to go around trees so that you don't need to remove a lot of mature vegetation, especially from lakeshore properties, in order to put in a septic system. You might think that the tree roots would destroy these lines, especially because the lines are providing nutrients, but this technology uses high pressure to move the water along and out of the drip line with enough force that the roots are not going to be getting close enough. And this is a property in Colchester that installed these. The company that did it was Advanced On-Site Septic Services. So yeah, these are pretty cool alternative septic system. And we do have a new fact sheet on our website that gives some guidance about all the kinds of alternative wastewater systems that have been and can be used in Vermont. Again, there's a link in this presentation that folks can use to find this fact sheet that was created with the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection, who are actually the on-site wastewater experts. So, getting into talking more about recreation areas and the kinds of things that we're really looking for in a lawn on a lakeshore property. So, in lawn areas that are like public use areas, a town beach or some other kind of access area, one of the things we are always suggesting to people is to ease compaction of that area and to create pathways that can be identified by people for use so that they're not just running willy-nilly all over a property. Compaction of soils can cause increased runoff into the lake. And grass is not a very good infiltration system. Water runs right over it. So to reduce that compaction and avoid the runoff, we do recommend creating pathways in those high traffic areas. The same does go for any lakeside property, but ones that are seeing a lot of foot traffic, it's definitely more necessary. Another thing when it comes to paths are that when they're built to go, straight up and down a hill, especially if at the bottom of that hill is your lakeshore, you want to make sure that you're creating water bars and just diverting water from the path off to the sides. So you're not creating the situation that we can see here on the left, where the water has just found the easiest way down the hill and is going straight down that path towards the lake. Other alternatives would include those permeable pavers that we were talking about earlier. So we always recommend meandering pathways or pathways with water bars. And these permeable pavers are great for public access areas because there are some instances like this one at the state park where you want to have, this is an ADA compliant walkway, so you want to have ADA access to your property. We also see permeable pavers used for things like patios, sometimes driveways. I think patios are more common. But these are a pretty cool way to put in a more permanent, stable path. And finally, infiltration steps. So on steep slopes going downhill to sort of access the water or access the lawn area where they're getting a lot of use and a lot of trampling, and now there's bare soil. We often recommend infiltration steps for these areas because they will prevent erosion and runoff, and will also direct foot traffic and minimize trampling. So, and then we often suggest, vegetation planted around the edges so people aren't trying to walk around your steps, and so that they'll look really nice and pretty, and also so you won't have that sort of bare soil on the sides. So when it comes to lawn areas on properties, obviously some people are using their lawns for things. Maybe they're doing a lot of recreation, like they're playing badminton or volleyball, or they have a ton of kids running around their lawn and they want to keep their lawn. And I always try to work with landowners to find what's going to be the best solution for them when it comes to their own property and their needs. But I also do think that some people just default to a green lawn, a big square. They don't want to put a lot of thought into it, and they just need some ideas to show them, what a property could look like. That's not just a big green lawn right down to the lake. So here you can see the before picture on the right, that's just showing a big empty lawn, or I'm sorry, on the left. And on the right is a mock-up of what that lawn could look like with some no-mow, and with some trees and gardens planted, and there's still space for recreation. There's still paths through the property, but just giving landowners some ideas of what they could be doing. This is just another example of, reducing sort of that open space. In this case, it wasn't even really a lawn. It was sort of very compacted looking, bare soil in the front of the house, and some native gardens were planted. There are persistent problems with beach erosion, especially at public access areas. Usually sand is being added to these sites and road runoff, at least at this particular beach, road runoff was entering the area, flowing over the lawn, hitting the beach, and knocking all of that sand into the lake. And so, what was the solution here? This is just a picture of the lawn and how it is pretty flat, but the water was running over it, and into the sand. The solution here, there could have been a few different methods used, but in this particular case, um, a barrier was planted between the lawn and the sand, that was working to slow and absorb the stormwater before it ever reached the sand. And so the beach is now kind of buffered. And you'll see uh, geese were a big problem on this lawn. Geese love lawns. They love them. They love open spaces. They don't want to be near vegetation. They don't want to be anywhere near where a predator might be hiding that wants to eat them or eat their babies. Um, and so the minute that geese see vegetation, they actually are very discouraged to come on to a flat lawn area. And so putting in this vegetation definitely helped to deter the geese. But what they also did was, instead of having just an opening in the vegetation for people to walk through, they overlapped the ends so that from the water, you can't tell that there's an opening in the vegetation. And it really helped to deter the geese from being on this lawn. So they kind of got two benefits out of this. They were able to stop and slow their stormwater and stop the erosion that was knocking all of their beach sand into the water, and they also got to solve their geese problem. So it is a win-win for everyone but the geese. Another example of a beach sort of BMP is Raponda Town Beach in Wilmington, and this is just another buffer. This was a much steeper slope. The road From the road, the land steeply slopes down to basically this beach area. It's all on a hill. And a lot of stormwater runoff was coming from that road down the hill and hitting the beach. And implementing this BMP of some coir logs and native plantings behind it, as well as an upland vegetated swale that you can't see in these pictures, helped to stop and slow that stormwater runoff from washing out the beach. And finally, the shorefront. So we've talked a lot today about sort of compounding problems for the property owner and the lake and the wildlife when we convert natural shores into lawns. And so my advice for pretty much everyone who lives on a lake is to revegetate your shoreline. And so this can be done in many different ways. One of them is buffer plantings. So in this particular example, there was sort of a steep drop off to the water that was stabilized using willow stakes. And willow stakes can also be really effective if there are small pockets of erosion and not your whole shoreline. So if you're finding, small pockets of areas that are, for whatever reason, eroding into the lake, willow stakes are really great natural way of stabilizing that. And they work really well because willows have naturally high levels of rooting hormones, and their fast growing roots allow for them to take hold fast and quickly stabilize soil. So that's one way. Another way is plantings that are not necessarily willow stakes or live stakings, but like you see at the top picture there, it's just a small buffer planting using potted native plants. And this can be done in ways to renaturalize shorelines. It can be done in a more of a landscaping fashion. We have two excellent presenters today who are going to talk about landscape design and native plants. So I'm not going to get too into it, but definitely planting a buffer is one solution. Another solution is creating no-mow zones. So a no-mow zone is exactly what it sounds like. You stop mowing that section of lawn and you let the vegetation grow up and sort of take over your shorefront while still maintaining access, still maintaining open areas that you're going to utilize, but letting some of that grow in. And here's just a lovely example of a Lakewise Award-winning property. This is Echo Lake in Charleston, Vermont. And a beautiful shoreline with lots of landscaping and natives lovingly cared for. And here's another one on Lake Iroquois that included more of like a no-mow and a little less of a landscaped look. Both are beautiful and both are helping to solve the problem of slowing down stormwater and creating resilient banks with lots of vegetation and lots of root structure and providing a lot of habitat to the wildlife around our lakes. So great job. And that's it for me this morning. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have for me. Yeah. And if there are no questions, we can move along to our next presenter. So I don't see any questions. So is Sarah here?
I'm here. Hi.
All right. Do you want to share your screen?
Sure.
All right. So then our next presenter is Sarah Hoffmeier. She's a landscape designer with Equilibrium. Is it landscape design? Equilibrium design?
Yeah. Yep, you got it.
In Montpelier. And she's going to talk to us today about native plants. So yeah, whenever you're ready, Sarah.
Oh, thanks. Hi, everybody. Can you all see my screen? Is it
We
working,
see
Alison?
Hmm?
You're seeing
Yeah,
my screen?
we see your screen.
Okay,
Yep.
great. I'm just going to point out really quickly before I go into my presentation, I have a handout that goes through, there are so many resources, so many online books, organizations. I've just put together a quick list of the ones that I use. And I'll point out a couple of the ones on this list, and it'll be available to you. Either Alison will give it to you, or if not, I can share it again. But I'll start just by giving a quick background as to how I got into plants. Back in 2007, I started working for a native plant nursery in Alexandria, Virginia. And that's truly where I started learning my plants, but I really fell in love with landscape design. So I took some classes at the George Washington University in DC, and then I'm not a city girl, so I applied for a bunch of different grad schools and was really lucky to get into the Conway School of Landscape Design in rural Western Massachusetts. And then I moved up to Vermont in 2009, late in 2009. And I have been gardening and experimenting and taking classes ever since. Real quick, something else I should point out is this is a really quick little chat about plants. So if you have questions, and just from 2 days ago, a lot of people did, and they got in touch afterwards, which I love. I've given my email, so please just email me. I really am a plant nerd and I love talking about plants, so we can always go deeper. So yeah, when I moved up to Vermont in 2009, I had a small gardening business, and then in 2014 was when my husband and I started Ecolibrium, which is when we do the site work, installation of our designs. Yeah, so that's just a little background. And then here's what we'll do today. We'll just, in the next 20 minutes, we'll go through a couple of recommendations that I have, definitions, so we're all on the same page. And then we'll get into some of my favorite natives. There are so many to choose from. You'll see on each of these slides, I just pop up a couple of my favorites. And something to note is when you're asking for natives at a nursery, to use the botanical name. So you'll see here, Viburnum dentatum. That is the straight species. That's the native that you want. Arrowwood is the common name, but when you can get those straight species and not cultivars or the nativars, that's even better. And we'll go into like why that's important a little bit later. Okay, so my big recommendation. I took this course maybe 7 years ago. It was a while ago. And the people that were in my class came from all different backgrounds. I actually had a bunch of people from DPW, Department of Public Works, and some other like site contractors, which was really cool. That's not my expertise, and so I could pick their brains about things, but they were not plant people. And so I fully respect not everyone loves plants as much as I do. And I say that so that when you have these projects, I think I see this with the clients that I work with, as well as just on bigger projects. I've partnered with cities and colleges where you have a lot of players, a lot of people on your team. And I do think it's really important to have someone who is the plant person, whether it's a landscape architect, a landscape designer, a gardening company, that just a professional, someone who already has their network of suppliers all set. It will make your project run just more smoothly. And a lot of times it can actually save you money. Those are the people that are coming in and they're assessing your site before you ever start construction. And they can point out some really valuable plants, trees, a lot of times that you want to keep or protect during construction. And they can also point out the things that you really need to manage for, like the invasives, which we'll talk about more. So on that list of resources, I'll just flip over to it really quickly. Under organizations, the two organizations that I'll point out are Vermont Nursery and Landscape Association. It's also called Greenworks. And if you don't know it, it's specific to Vermont. So a lot of the companies that are members are Vermont based. So that's where I'd start to search for members. And you can, again, search for companies that do design and install, just designers, just gardeners. It's a good resource. And then if you're working outside of Vermont or want a company that is outside of Vermont, Ecological Landscape Alliance is another great company or great organization. And you, again, just search for members. And then my other big recommendation, and these really don't have to do with specific like native plants yet, is using high quality materials. And this might sound intuitive, but I can't tell you the number of times I've had clients, and I do work more with residential clients. So although I do take on bigger projects, I have to say like 90% of my work during the year is with homeowners. And they'll say, oh, I've got my neighbor John has a pile of topsoil and he said he'd give it to me for $10. And I'm like, don't do it. You never know what kind of weeds, noxious weeds or invasives are already in that topsoil. And even though you might be saving a buck up front, it can lead to bigger problems. So just really using reliable sources for your topsoil, compost, and plants. And again, on this resource page, down at the bottom, I've given 2 columns of, these are the nurseries that I happen to use most. This first column in particular, they're really great with sourcing seeds locally and just really knowledgeable about native species. So anyway, that's a good reference for nurseries. For topsoil and compost, I got this question 2 days ago. And I have to say that I usually source my topsoil through bigger companies. So nurseries, a lot of times Horsford or Gardener Supply. But any of the larger companies are going to have, in general, higher quality, because if they didn't, there would be so much pushback from all the contractors that they would be out of business, or they wouldn't be recommended. So anyway, that is probably the path that I would take. There are, of course, smaller companies that have topsoil and compost that you could go with too, but just not using the free stuff that you're not sure where it came from. That's a big one. And my other last recommendation with topsoil would be, if you can save the topsoil from the site that you're working on, that is a huge savings. And you know that this gets deeper into the microorganisms and the mycorrhizae and all the other things that are in that soil that are local and already established. You're saving it and reusing it, so you don't have to bring in a lot more input to get that soil growing again. Okay, and then what is a native plant? This is a term. There's a big range. It's not black and white. There's a big gray zone in between. And I'm trying to kind of show that with that little image of the exploding bubbles. Some people, and this is with plant people, this is within the plant industry, will say, I plant native plants that are native to North America. That's a big range, but that's everything that is non-exotic and considered native to them. For me, I really try to plant plants that are native to Vermont. And I'm just going to point out my most used books. This book right here, Art Gilman's New Flora of Vermont. This one really goes into depth on what counties have different natives. So he does political boundaries. So he'll go Washington County, Chittenden County. Really great book. It's not an easy read. It's not something you're going to pick up on your coffee table and read, then flip through. It's more like a dictionary. And then the other book that I want to point out is Wetland, Woodland, Wildland. And this one, again, there are no online equivalents to these two books. They're just really specific to Vermont, and a lot of good research. They've been doing it for decades. The authors are super experienced. I've heard them all talk too. Just really fascinating people. They love their jobs. They love plants. But Wetland, Woodland, Wildland is really specific to native plant communities within Vermont. So if you have, a gravel river shore, it will go through and list the different species that are naturally found on that gravel river shore within Vermont. Very cool. I don't use that book quite as much, but I can see how you would if you're doing a big restoration project to make it easy. Get those plants that are already supposed to be there. When it comes to the definition of a native, the general, and this is agreed upon by lots of people, are natives to Vermont, to wherever you are in North America, are the plants that were here before European settlement. So that was late 1700s, early 1800s. Those are typically the plants that we call our natives to Vermont. Even more important than natives, I would say, are the invasive species. Oh my gosh. So if you can, and this goes back to like hiring a professional, if you're not a plant person. I didn't point this out last time, but there are a bunch of different apps that you can use on your phone to help you ID things, ID plants. And I unfortunately, I don't use a lot of them because I've been doing this forever, and it's something that I study. And so I really don't use the apps, but I have used iNaturalist, which is also Seek. And that one I found to be pretty reliable. Anyway, and those ones you can definitely use to help you identify invasives, but always ask a professional. When you get to a site and you have a project, I think this is one of the most important parts of it, is to see if you have invasives. These are the plants that once you start disturbing the soil, they're opportunistic, they're gonna come in, they're gonna take root, and no matter how well planned your native planting is, they're not going to establish if you've got that competition from invasives. So you've got to manage for invasives. Number one thing before you do anything on a site. I got this question 2 days ago too, that when I'm managing invasives, it is a multi-year process. So it's one of those things, as you're scoping out sites, you really want to note, are there invasives present? And some of them, it's a real maintenance nightmare. So it might factor into your budget for follow-up. That's a big one. Okay, and the other thing I want to point out just with definitions, so invasives, noxious weeds, if you see either of those terms used for a plant, those are the worst of the worst, the bad players. VTinvasives.org is a great website to go to identify invasives and also with management recommendations. If you see the terms exotic or non-native, those are not bad. It doesn't mean it's bad. I plant a ton of plants that are not exotic, just means not native to North America. And I plant a bunch of those things all the time. People love peonies. So for a lot of homeowners, I plant a bunch of peonies. We don't have a native peony. None of them are from here. But they don't cause harm to our knowledge. We don't know yet. Jury might still be out, but to our 200 years of planting them, they haven't outcompeted our native species and caused displacement of different organisms. So they're okay. Okay, and the real heart of this whole thing of like, why do we plant natives? I've put up 2 bulleted points and something else that I'll share with you. Alison, I'll give it to her afterwards to share if you're interested. I go through and I read a bunch of academic journals on plants, totally nerd bomber, but there's a lot of things we haven't studied and that we don't know. So taking a step back, I think something that's really important to look at is that before humans were ever in Vermont, even before indigenous people, for thousands of years, our native flora was co-evolving with fungi, with mycorrhizae, with the soil organisms, with the animals. And there's all these relationships, and a lot of them we don't even understand yet. They haven't been studied. So just using your common sense of natives have been here for thousands and thousands of years, and they're doing these ecosystem services. We know they're doing ecosystem services, but the relationships, all those different, that web of connections is really complex. And so I've never read an academic article that has said putting a native back in is a negative thing. So right there, you can't do harm by replanting natives. And then the things that have been studied are they feed our native wildlife. And this has been studied. Someone who's not on the resource page, I should have put him, was Doug Tallamy. He's studied this forever. He's a professor down in Connecticut. And I actually have 2 of his academic journals articles that I'll give to Alison to hand out. But one of the things that he's studied is a straight species. And the example I give here is Physocarpus opulifolius. It's our native 9-bark. It's a great plant to use along riverbanks. It grows naturally there. In the nursery trade, this plant has been modified to, the cultivar is called Diabolo, which you see with the dark maroon purple leaves. It's a beautiful plant. I mean, it's stunning. When it was modified, it changed the chemical composition of the leaf. So not only did it change the color, but it actually changed the scent and the chemicals that are in the leaf so that the native insects no longer eat it. And anecdotally, I can just say, like, when I've planted the straight species of 9-bark, it does get eaten by insects. And that's its natural habitat. It doesn't kill the plant. It just gets a little bit of insect damage. Diablo does not get insect damage. So homeowners love it because they're like, look, it looks beautiful. It hasn't been eaten, but it's also not providing that the food for our native wildlife. If that doesn't get you, the other thing is that our native plants just require less input and that they're better suited for our climate. They don't need to be fertilized as much. Everything needs to get established. So watering is a big input in that first year. Hopefully you can time your plantings with good weather. Especially some of the restoration projects that I've worked on, we try to time it in the early spring so that we've got a little bit more wetter soil conditions, or in the late fall when the temperatures are going down. But yeah, in general, native plants, once they're established, you should not be I do not set up irrigation systems. I give the example of a vegetable garden. That is the only exception of when I am planting things, and I say, oh, yeah, you need irrigation. But in the landscape, you should not have irrigation systems in Vermont. That's one of my solid rules. Don't do it. Okay, and then I'll quickly just run through a couple of my favorite native plants. The trees and the shrubs are going to be the backbone uh, of your planting. And I know Holly is going to talk more about design, and actually a bunch of the other presenters are going to talk about design. But the trees and shrubs are truly going to be the workhorses of your plantings. And so making sure that they're protected in those first couple of years, I think is really, really important and well taken care of, especially if you're spending a lot of money on them. I know with the restoration projects that I've done, when we're planting whips or bare rootstock, we have thousands of them and we're just getting them in the ground. You know, the goal is not to take care of each individual plant, but to plant as many as you can so that even if only 20% live, you have a lot to go with. But if you're spending more money, like getting balled and burlapped, you know, clients a lot of times will spend hundreds of dollars on just one tree. And in that case, you really want to protect for deer. That's a big one. So deer go after, just looking at this list right here, the deer will eat balsam fir. They annihilate that. They eat serviceberry. They go after red maple like crazy. The other ones are pretty safe. Cottonwood, hawthornbeam, those ones are pretty safe, but you have to protect for deer. And then a couple of our native shrubs. I'll just point out a few. Willow are always easy breezy. I rarely have a problem with any of the willow species, and we have tens of willow species, native willow species. I can't remember what the number is. It might be like 30 native types of willow. I can't remember the actual number, so don't take that to heart, but we have a lot. My favorite, though, is pussy willow. That one, Salix discolor, is one of my faves. It's just so easy to grow. And willow are one of the few live staking that really take easily. I know I had a question that was about speckled alder and live staking, and I don't have experience with that one, but I just know from the people that I've worked with that willows are the most reliable ones for live staking. The other two plants that I want to just quickly point out are witch hazel, which is one of my favorites. Hamamelis virginiana is our native willow. And that one I've used because it can take some pretty dry conditions, and I use it as an understory plant to larger trees. So it will thrive and grow as the trees are getting bigger, and then they can tolerate some shade. So it's a good long-term shrub. A lot of plants need require full sun. And so when your trees get bigger or your shrubs get bigger, they can shade things out. So I try to pick plants that have more longevity than that. Dogwood is another great one, and our native honeysuckle. There's a native honeysuckle. Don't let people tell you it's invasive. The easy way to tell is you snip one of the branches. Our native honeysuckle does not have a pith, a hole that's in the middle of that stem. All the invasive species have a pith. That's the easiest way to identify it. But those three plants, witch hazel, dogwood, and honeysuckle, can all take shade, part shade, and they will look just as beautiful. And then I just have a couple more slides. The perennial plants get the most attention. People get so excited about them because I think this is where homeowners or your clients, it's the opportunity to see those pollinators and kind of interact with your landscape a little bit more than some of the other plants. So I always point out cardinal flower is one of my favorites. It attracts hummingbirds. And Penstemon digitalis is one of my other favorites also for the bees. The bumblebees just love this one. It self-seeds really easily too, so that because you never want bare soil. So picking some of the perennials that will self-seed and fill in areas as the shrubs and trees are growing, I think is a really good strategy. And then finally, our native grasses and ferns and sedges and rushes. These get overlooked a lot because they're not as showy, but they are workhorses in a landscape. So the grasses, I a lot of times will plant upslope from water bodies, but I use them frequently in rain gardens. All of these species, the blue stem, little blue stem, and switchgrass, can take inundation. They just don't want to be wet for a long amount of time, which rain gardens should be quickly drained. The one I do plant in like standing water basically is the juncus. That one is it's our native soft rush. It can take pretty wet conditions and still be happy. Ferns are another, they spread really well. They can take shade. All of these don't get deer pressure. The deer leave all of these plants alone. So that's another reason why I use them frequently, is you don't have to spray or do temporary fencing. And then finally, what can you do to get more natives? Because I have had this problem where, you say to clients, we got to use natives, and then it's hard to find them. Nurseries are coming around. The demand has gone up for natives, which is fantastic. But what you can do as the contractor and as the experts that are advising your clients is to tell them to ask for the straight species more often, and don't accept those substitutes. I've had it happen where I go to a nursery and I'm like, okay, I need, here, we'll use this example, Asclepias incarnata, swamp milkweed. And they'll go, oh, we don't have that, but we have Asclepias incarnata daisy rose. And I'm like, that's where it goes back to Diabolo, the cultivars. Sometimes they don't provide those same ecosystem services that you want. So that's where asking a professional can help. And that's it for my chat. So if anyone has questions, I'd love to take them. Let's see if I can get back. Here we go. Does anyone have any plant questions? And if you're too shy to ask here too, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to talk plants.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. You shared a couple of books. Hi, thank you. Your presentation was great. Same with your energy and enthusiasm. I love it. Oh. What you talked about a couple of books. I'm curious, when landowners or people that you work with inquire, are there books that you recommend to them that you find have been easy for them to digest and absorb?
Yeah, there are a couple. Let me look around my library real quick. Yes, there are a few. There's a couple that I put in that resource page. Donald Leopold and Alan Armitage are both, they're fantastic. They're just really easy to read. Let me just look really quickly because I know I have a bunch over here that, here, I'll show you this one. These two. There we go. Okay, so this one's Alan Armitage. This one's on the list. And Donald Leopold. These ones are really easy to digest. Yeah, they're not for the sciencey people.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, and I can I'll think up a couple others that I've given to clients. There's a few that you see them in the bookstores all the time, and a lot of times they're really markety, and they'll say natives, but when you dig deeper into it, it's not native to Vermont. It's like they're native to like Eastern US. And so it can throw people off, I think. And they're like, oh, but it says in this book, the printed versions, it's really hard to get that local ecotype. And that's where these two are really good for the Northeast, Alan and Donald. But a lot of the online resources are better at getting more localized. And that one, Go Botany, is a great one, Native Plant Trust. Yeah, and I'll think of a couple others, but I'll share that resource page too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah, we do have one question in the chat. And it says, would you remove invasives by root due to vegetative reproduction, or leave roots to secure shoreland stabilization?
Oh, this is such a good question, because I've worked with Friends of the Winooski, and there were spots along our Winooski River that had a lot of Asian honeysuckle, and that's the invasive honeysuckle. And we left it for that very reason in a bunch of different spots, because we didn't have enough resources to keep up with it. So you have to have, and this is what I tell clients all the time, is start small. Start really, really small when you're trying to eradicate an invasive species, and grow. Because first of all, it's frustrating and it can be totally overwhelming, and you might have the energy one year, and then year two, you're like, I don't have time for it, and they just come back. So start small, be really thorough, keep up with it, and it really depends on the species. So a lot of times with the honeysuckle, we'll cut it back. I work with the Montpelier Tree Board, and we do a lot of invasive removal. And so honeysuckle is one that when it's gigantic and you need an excavator to get it out, which I've seen happen. The same is true with burning bush. Cut it back to, you're just cutting it back to the stump, leaving like about 12 inches. And then come back the next year, you're going to get stump sprouting, but those you can pull. But you're weakening the plant. And it's a multi-year process. It takes a lot of dedication, but keep at it. But yes, if you don't have the manpower or the resources to tackle, especially along sensitive places like the riverbanks, I would leave it. Yeah, because it's better to have it than the erosion that we get, which stinks. It's not a good solution. Yeah.
Yeah. Lesser of two evils, maybe.
Yeah.
All right, Dave Wheeler, I hope that answered your question as well. Dave was just asking for some more information about invasive species removal. So hopefully that covered it. I don't see any other questions.
vtinvasives.org. The vtinvasives.org is really good with management. And really, there are some smart people that work there too. So I highly recommend calling them because it's not what I do 100% of the time. So get the people that do it 100% of the time. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. So I don't see any other questions, so we're going to move along. Thank you, Sarah. That was great. And so our next presenter is Laura Dlugolecki. Laura works for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation in the Lakes and Ponds program. She conducts regulatory review for projects under the Shoreline Protection Act, lake encroachment and the use of public waters rules, and provides outreach and technical assistance for lakeshore property owners. I'm going to cut your bio short, Laura. I'm sorry. And you are muted. And Laura is going to talk to us today about the Shoreline Protection Act and lake and shoreland permitting. So take it away, Laura.
Okay. My screen is not being shared, is it?
We can see your screen. It's not in the full screen view, though.
Okay. All right. Hopefully the slideshow starts in just a second. Okay, there we go. Is that good?
Yep.
Great.
You're all set.
Okay. Well, thanks, Alison. And as Alison mentioned, I work in the Lakes and Ponds program with lake and shoreland regulations. And today we're talking about a lot of on the land applications for restoration, making lakeshore properties more lake friendly, erosion control type things. And some of these activities may require a permit. Some of those might be from our Lakes and Ponds program or elsewhere. I'll try to touch very briefly on where else you might need a permit, but my goal today is not for you to know all the ins and outs of all the details of the types of permits we have, because if you don't interact with them every day, you don't need to know the nitty-gritty. My goal is for you to think about projects that are happening on the land and that you might need a permit, and that you should call myself or one of my colleagues or someone at the state to find out if you need a permit. So in the Lakes and Ponds program where I work, we have 3 different regulations for which permits are issued, and they're delineated by where they are on the landscape. So we have lake encroachment, shoreline protection, and aquatic nuisance control. And there's this line that's called the mean water level, which is kind of the jurisdictional line between where different regulations come into play. On most of our inland lakes in Vermont, the mean water level is basically the shoreline that you see, because there's not a ton of fluctuation in water level, except for lakes that have big drawdowns, which is just a couple. Lake Champlain and some other lakes have larger fluctuations in water level, and so they have a very set, defined mean water level. So when I use this term mean water level, you can kind of think about where water meets the land, the shoreline, for most of our inland lakes. So lake encroachment are activities that involve the placement of material at or beyond the mean water level, so out in the lake. Shoreland protection is generally regulated are development-based activities that are at the mean water level and back across the landscape for 250 feet. And then aquatic nuisance control is the control of aquatic plants, managing nuisance or invasive plants in the water, beyond the mean water level, not on land. But we're not really going to be talking about that today. I just want you to know that it exists, and it's one of the regulations that we manage in our program. So I'm going to focus on shoreline protection and lake encroachment. Shoreline protection is the one that's on land, and the two things that require authorization for the most part are the removal of vegetation, removal of protected vegetation, and the creation of new impervious surfaces. So imagine surfaces that water can't flow through, like paved and unpaved driveways, rooftops, any kind of compacted or concrete area. Those are impervious surfaces. Lake encroachment are those activities at the shoreline and out into the water. Typically, those are stabilization type projects, which we'll be talking about a lot today. Any kind of placement of riprap or culvert replacement. And also it's the alteration of the lake bottom, so dredging, removing sediment from the water body. So I'm going to dive into the Shoreline Protection Act first. And this was passed in 2014. So this past summer, we had our 10-year anniversary. I think in most of the time I've been working here, we've been talking about it as this new regulation, this new law, but it's really, it's not new anymore. It's 10 years old. And I think we've really seen a lot of the towns come on board, realtors, homeowners are aware of it. And so we've also had a decade of implementing these regulations and kind of refining how we look at these projects and how we review them. And so the purpose of this act is to promote lake-friendly development and redevelopment. We do restrict regulatory development within the protected shoreland area, but it's not prevented altogether. It's meant to balance new development, the development is there, but also promote the protection of water quality and habitat and natural shorelines. You know, we saw this trend of converting a lot of small seasonal camps in wooded environments to larger suburban year-round homes. And this, as Alison mentioned in the first talk, you know, we have very densely developed lake shores. They're more densely developed than Burlington, than our urban areas in Vermont. These are the most densely developed places in the state. Vermonters like to have a lot of land, but our lake shores, many of them are these little postage stamp lots. So when everybody starts converting to larger suburban homes, it has a large impact on water quality and erosion. And there's been a loss of land, which, you know, impacts fish and wildlife habitat. So we're looking to kind of shift our cultural view from this suburban aesthetic of lawn to lake and be more protective, where we can still have our lakeshore homes, but also have those co-benefits of erosion control, which protects water quality and protects fish and wildlife habitat, to have a more natural habitat and where our homes kind of fit in the natural habitat. So the Shoreline Protection Act, kind of what the nitty-gritty of what the regulations say is it applies to the land within 250 feet of the shoreline. That 250 feet is measured horizontally through the landscape. And that we call that the protected shoreland area. It's broken into two areas, the lakeside zone, which is the first 100 feet. And that area is where activities are restricted the most. It's the most protected area. And then there's the upland zone, which is the remaining 150 feet. And we kind of look at that as more of the development zone, where we want to direct most development when we can. So the components that the Shoreland Protection Act looks at is how much impervious surface is on a parcel. And I mentioned that before. Those are those areas that water can't flow through. So it could be a rooftop or even a deck, if it's depending on how it's constructed, paved and unpaved parking areas, driveways. We're looking at the total amount of cleared area on a parcel. So a cleared area, you can think of that as the opposite of unmaintained vegetative cover. So forested areas are vegetated cover, anywhere that's unmaintained. Cleared areas are anything that's developed with impervious surface. So obviously your house is cleared area, but so are grass lawn, landscaped areas, any kind of bare soil, anything that's not an unmaintained wild area is a cleared area. We also regulate the setback, how close that development pressure is to the shoreline. And we regulate where development occurs on the landscape in terms of slope. So we try to direct development off of steep slopes to prevent, to keep stability and prevent erosion issues down the line. So the standards of the Shoreline Protection Act, if you're going to propose a project, we look at that project in terms of the Shoreline Protection Act standards. So what the law says is that all new development must be set back 100 feet from the mean water level or the shoreline. The slope of the project must be 20% or less. All impervious surface on the parcel must be 20% or less, and all cleared area on the parcel must be 40% or less. So what this looks like on the landscape with this drawing is that if you imagine a forested, undeveloped lot, someone wants to develop it, they could get a shoreland permit to begin clearing about 100 feet from the shoreline. And then the permit would also allow them to put in a structure. It looks like it's about 110 feet from the shoreline here. You want a little buffer, so you would start with your cleared area at 100 feet and then your development. Put in a driveway, a parking area, and a garage. So they met the setback standard, and then everything is on a slope of less than 20%. Impervious surface cleared area standards are met. So if someone proposed this project on an undeveloped lot and it met all those standards, we could issue a permit and that project could go forward. This isn't always the reality of what's on the landscape. There are some lots that exist out there that aren't 250 feet deep. They may not even be 100 feet deep. We call these non-conforming lots because they cannot conform to that 100-foot setback. So for development to go forward on a lot like this, it has to have been created before the Shoreline Protection Act went into place. So we see a couple of these every year where a lot has existed. It's been in somebody's family. It's never been developed. It was created in the 50s. Those lots are still developable. And in this scenario, we would work with the landowner to find a location on site that is as far back as possible from the water. We cannot authorize anything within 25 feet of the water. So if you have just a tiny little 30-foot deep lot, then that's probably not going to be developable. But in this scenario, we have it as far back as possible, probably have to have some 20-foot setback from the road according to the town. We would work with them on that. But once we figure out what's the farthest back setback for development, all the other standards have to be met concerning the slope, impervious surface, and cleared area. And as I kind of touched on, somebody could not create today, after the Shoreline Protection Act went into place, after 2014, a new lot that is 90 feet deep and expect it to be developed. The lot has to be older in order to have this non-conforming setback exemption. But by far the most common scenario that we see here in Vermont is that there are lots that were developed within 100 feet already prior to the Shoreline Protection Act going into effect. A lot of these camps were built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, pretty close to the water. And so these are non-conforming lots, and they are, development is still allowed to occur. Basically, the way I try to explain it to people is that in 2014, when the Shoreline Protection Act was passed, it took kind of a snapshot in time. And what you had before the act, you can keep, you can maintain, you can expand to a degree if you can meet the standards of the Shoreline Protection Act, but nothing can move closer to the mean water level than what is already there. If you're within 100 feet, you can't, if you're already 80% cleared, you can't become 82% cleared. If you're already 25% impervious surface, you can't become 26% impervious surface. So you can't become more impactful than you already are. So in this scenario, parcel might be developed, the house might be around 60 feet from the shoreline, and somebody would like to put a small expansion on. This is something we could allow. It just cannot move closer to the water. And then all the other standards have to be met regarding slope, impervious surface, and cleared area. So that setback standard is the one that is probably the strongest part of the Shoreline Protection Act. We do not want impervious surface to move closer to the water. However, there's one small exemption for every parcel. This was written into the Shoreline Protection Act, I think, kind of with the thought that people could have maybe a small shed or patio, gazebo, or something closer to the water. It's a one-time exemption per parcel that allows a small 100 square foot shed or whatever it might be that's set back at least 25 feet from the water. And that's called a shoreland registration. So as I kind of just alluded to, you know, some parcels already exceed all the standards. There is a little bit of wiggle room in those cases, but in order to authorize development on those parcels that are already exceeding the development standards, they must, as a requirement of the permit, install some sort of best management practice. So for vegetation removal, if you're already above the 40% cleared area and you need to remove a couple trees, we are going to require a 1-for-1 replacement. And we require that vegetation that is removed be replaced with native vegetation. And also we have like a little calculator, because obviously removing 2 big mature trees is not the same as planting 2 smaller saplings. So we might require a larger revegetation area to take 2 older trees. If you are reconstructing a driveway or putting in a different driveway on a steep slope, we might require something like an open top culvert or a water bar that directs water into a vegetated area in order to authorize that driveway. For impervious surface, often we work with people to remove other impervious surface on their parcel that they're not using, or convert those areas to pervious surfaces. We also work with people to install gravel drip line infiltration trenches to capture stormwater runoff from the roof. And we have some great tools available that we work with landowners all the time, like the stormwater calculator, which tells us if you need to offset 300 square feet of impervious surface, then you need this many linear feet of gravel drip line infiltration trench that is this long and this wide. So we've kind of dialed it into a numbers game a bit to try to make sure that we are adequately offsetting the impacts being proposed. So that's kind of a nutshell of what the Shoreline Protection Act really, we're just looking at percentages and numbers and distance from shoreline. And then in addition to those requirements, there are a few exemptions to shoreland permitting. These are the most common ones. There are more. I think I just want to highlight a couple of these. One is the reconstruction within an existing footprint. So if you have an existing home and you want to tear it down and rebuild it in the exact same footprint from the overhead view, you would not need a shoreland permit. Our program is not concerned with any kind of interior configuration or height of the building. We just look at the impervious surface footprint from the overhead view. So, you know, towns, local zoning may have concerns about interior configuration, but that is not us. We just care about the overhead view. So any kind of tear down rebuild does not need a permit from us if it's in the exact same footprint. If you were to remove a 500 square foot structure and rebuild it in a slightly different location, that would need a permit, because our trigger for the need of a permit is a change of footprint. Removing dead, diseased, and unsafe trees. This is probably the thing that we get the most phone calls about. You can remove trees that are in danger of hitting a structure, like your home or your driveway or your garage. The roots have to remain in the ground, but they can be cut down, and just kind of, you can manage that singular threat. We've worked with people who are experiencing emerald ash borer infestations to remove those without a permit, but generally we encourage some revegetation. Every parcel is allowed to have one access to the lake. So that can be up to a 6-foot wide footpath, and there's no restriction on what that is. It could be a staircase, it could be infiltration steps, it could be a meandering dirt pathway, it could be a paved ADA accessible pathway, but just one. We have a little bit of vegetation management that's allowed using a somewhat complicated point and grid system. Again, that's just cutting off the tree, leaving the roots in the ground, not disturbing any vegetation around those trees. But if you're in a more thickly forested area, you can do a little bit of thinning to open up the views without a permit. Again, these are all things that it's great to reach out to us and ask us and check to make sure, just because, if you exceed these exemptions, then you're in permit territory, and it's just good to ask first. You can maintain your existing lawns and gardens. You can take out landscaping and put in different landscaping. No permit required. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Here's just kind of some examples. We see a lot of, trees right up against a home. Those definitely qualify as an unsafe tree. If it's a little further away and questionable, we encourage people to reach out to an arborist, but something like this, very clearly, this could be unsafe. And it's an exemption, so you don't need a permit to remove it. But I always encourage people to send us a picture, give us a call or an email or whatever, because when neighbors hear chainsaws, they tend to call us right away. There's a lot of misconceptions about the Shoreline Protection Act, and a lot of people believe that you can't do anything. And there are restrictions, and we're meant to be very protective of vegetation, but there are allowances, especially for these kinds of situations that could be unsafe. And here's just a nice picture of an area that has a lot of mixed vegetation with trees and shrubs, and the home is kind of incorporated into a more forested landscape. This is kind of the idea of what we're moving towards. I'm going to switch gears and very briefly talk about lake encroachment. So lake encroachment is quite different from shoreline protection. It's been in place since 1968. And in Vermont, property lines end at the mean water level. So once you go into the lake, you are in public waters. And so we look at this in a different way than we do on the regulations that regulate private property. This is a public resource. And so it regulates basically often private activities that happen in a public space. Common lake encroachments are docks, stabilization projects, dredging, boat ramp repair, marinas, boathouses, water intake lines. Those are all activities that are happening out in public water. But several lake encroachments, the really common ones, are exempt from lake encroachment permitting. Most private docks, so meaning they're non-commercial, any marina docks need permits from us. But non-commercial docks, as long as they meet these standards, less than 50 feet in length, less than 500 square feet in area, and that they're either floating or mounted on posts, they would not need a permit. So that's most of the private docks you see in Vermont. There are remnant concrete docks or solid earthen fill crib docks that exist. Those would not be allowed anymore. If you have those kind of old docks, they can be repaired with a lake encroachment permit, but we wouldn't issue a permit for a new dock like that. Most buoys, moorings, duck blinds, floats, rafts, those are also all exempt from permitting. When we do get a proposed lake encroachment project, with Shoreline Protection Act, I mentioned how we're using numbers and calculations and based on the parcel size to decide whether or not it meets the standards and whether or not we can authorize a permit. Projects out in public water are a little bit different. We're looking at what are the impacts on public resources, on what we call the public good, and that includes water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, vegetation, recreational impacts, and we're also looking at the public trust. Is this taking up too much public space for a private purpose? Is there any way that we can make this smaller and still meet the goals of the project? So we're kind of looking at it on kind of a balancing scale on whether or not we can authorize the project. And one public good that we often use to authorize lake encroachment projects is erosion control, protecting the shoreline, because that protects water quality for the entire resource. The most common lake encroachments that we review and authorize are shoreline stabilization projects. And there's kind of two different camps of shoreline stabilization. One is structural. These are the vertical concrete or wooden retaining walls. This is kind of the older way of stabilizing the shoreline. This was more common in the past. We don't typically authorize these projects too much anymore. There are issues with the installation of these types of projects. First of all, a vertical wall really puts a barrier in between the aquatic and the terrestrial world. So all the creatures that need to travel between those two areas are blocked off and they're not able to. Additionally, when ice hits the lower parts of these walls, it causes a lot of undermining and scouring. Waves bounce off and go back into the lake, creating additional erosion elsewhere in the lake. So there is a perception that these are stronger and hold a shoreline better, but actually they cause a lot of issues. And we've found that these non-structural stabilization techniques hold up better, are much better for ice push and dissipating wave energy. And that over time, with the installation of natural stone and vegetation, that they provide all those important co-benefits like habitat, ecosystem services. They help infiltrate more runoff. So this is the way that we're going, using biodegradable materials, natural stone, vegetation, slope designs when possible. When people do have existing vertical retaining walls, we do allow them to repair them and replace them with a lake encroachment permit. But if anybody's coming in with a new stabilization project, we steer them towards these non-structural methods. Rarely we have situations where a vertical engineered solution is the only solution. But that's only happened a handful of times. Most lake properties, we can find a non-structural solution. Okay, kind of wrapping up my presentation, I have a little quiz that you can kind of, do in your head. When we do this in person, people can shout it out. It's a little harder online, but I just want to say we are a resource for you, and we have a regional model across the state. So I have two other colleagues that do the same job as I do, and you can call us, you can email us, we can come out and do site visits, we can review site plans. It's always best to just ask first about whether or not a project needs a permit. And working near lake shores, there are often wetlands and streams. In certain water bodies like Lake Champlain and Lake Bomoseen, Lake Memphremagog, the Army Corps of Engineers has some jurisdiction. So we can help guide you for those types of projects, but it's always great to ask. All right, so here's an example in the high water events of 2011. This is Lake Champlain. This area got completely washed out. I think the homeowners tried to throw down some concrete blocks, which wasn't really doing anything, but this area was heavily eroded after the high water event. And so some rock was brought in, fill, and then it was stabilized with biodegradable fabric and planted with native plants. So all this work was done above the mean water level on land in an existing cleared area. Is this a project that would need a permit? The answer is no. No vegetation needed to be removed. No creation of cleared area. Everything was above the mean water level, so no lake encroachment and no impervious So this is not an activity that would have required a permit. This is the fishing access area at Lake Iroquois. It was heavily trampled and eroded, and here they are installing some fiber core rolls, and this area was regraded and planted with native vegetation. So I didn't say this explicitly, but anytime you've got heavy machinery going into the water like this, that is a lake encroachment. So working with heavy machinery at or beyond the mean water level, definitely need to reach out to us because that's a lake encroachment. And then installing materials at or beyond the mean water level, that is also a lake encroachment. And so this project was permitted. This is a project along Lake Bomoseen, and I think it'll be mentioned later today. But this road, Cedar Mountain Road, was heavily eroding, so much so that it was undermining. You could stick an arm under the road in certain parts. This area received heavy ice push, or it still does receive heavy ice push. And so encapsulated soil lifts were installed, beginning furthest lakeward with a stone toe, and then these encapsulated soil lifts, which were planted with native plants along several hundred feet of shoreline. This took heavy machinery, installing materials like rocks and biodegradable materials. This is something that did need a lake encroachment permit. This was Lake Dunmore, and there was this retaining wall, wooden retaining wall, lots of vegetation growing on top of it and around it. The wall was failing. The homeowner wanted to replace the wall. So this was kind of a double permit requirement. In order to remove the wall, several trees had to be cut down. Many trees had to be cut down. We required revegetation in a different location so that when he replaced the wall in the future, he wouldn't have to cut down trees again. So this was a situation where 2 permits were required. The replacement of the wall required a lake encroachment, the removal of trees required shoreline protection, and then shoreline protection requirements kicked in to do a pretty significant revegetation elsewhere on the parcel. This is near this is Black Pond, I think, or Breeze Pond maybe, in Hubbardton. And they were installing a replacement culvert. So the culvert extends into the water, and also they added riprap around the structure. So this was something where they were working with heavy machinery, putting material in the water, definitely needed a lake encroachment permit. This is Lake Dunmore. They've got a home here close to the water, and then down out over the water is a boathouse. So if this homeowner proposed to remove that house and rebuild it in the exact same footprint without removing any trees, that would not need a shoreland permit. If they wanted to construct a new deck or patio, this is something that I'm not sure if I mentioned exactly, but decks and patios can either be pervious or impervious depending on how they're constructed. And we do have some standards on our webpage basically about pervious design. So water can flow through the deck boards. It's not on some kind of compacted surface. There's no roof. That stormwater is managed from that structure. So we can authorize pervious structures. It's not something that needs a permit, but we do have a review process where the landowner basically certifies that something is pervious, and it's kind of an agreement that you're going to keep it as pervious long term. So if the deck or patio is impervious, then yes, it needs a permit. If it's pervious, it needs some sort of authorization. If you're rebuilding the house and adding a little bit to the footprint, then yeah, that's the change of footprint, new impervious surface. It would require a permit. Similarly, if you are rebuilding the same square footage house, but you're just moving it over or moving it back, which is something that we try to work with homeowners to do all the time, but you're changing the footprint, you still need a permit. And then finally, if that boathouse the foundation is failing and they need to replace the foundation or rebuild the boathouse in the same footprint, yes, this would need a lake encroachment permit. So lake encroachment is different than shoreland. Even if you're working in the same footprint, once you're out in public waters and you're adding and removing materials, it needs a lake encroachment. And under lake encroachment, we would not authorize new boathouses anymore because that's a private use of public resources that doesn't have a public benefit, and it's not exempt like a private dock, but existing boathouses can be maintained. Most of the best management practice installation that you're talking about today does not need a shoreland permit, provided you're not removing any trees. Typically, these don't use any kind of impervious surface. They're either vegetative or pervious. So you can definitely reach out and ask about these types of installations, but they typically don't need any kind of shoreland permit. There's several different types of vegetation management that does not need a permit. You know, as I mentioned, the removal of dead, diseased, and unsafe trees. You can remove invasive noxious weeds and noxious weeds that are on the state list of noxious weeds without a permit. I alluded very briefly to this point and grid system that allows for some vegetation management, some thinning of heavily forested areas without a permit. But anything beyond that requires authorization. And so this is kind of the tricky area, and it's really good for you to reach out and ask us about these questions. Yeah, and anything beyond those exemptions requires a shoreline permit. There are lots of other permits that may apply in your lakes and ponds. If you reach out to us, we're happy to help guide you towards the correct people to talk to. I just want to put in a plug for the wetlands program. Wetlands and lakes often go hand in hand. Often parts of lakes are mapped as wetlands. And if a wetland is considered a class 2 wetland, the wetland has a 50-foot buffer around it that is protected. And so any activity in that area would need a wetlands permit. And, you know, I think when you're on your site, if you see cattails, if the ground is very wet, you know, you might be in a wetland, and those visual cues are a good prompt to reach out to the wetlands ecologist. You can also use our Natural Resources Atlas. This is a great tool. In this picture here, I've turned on the Shoreline Protection Act layer. And so that first orange strip you see is the first 100 feet of the protected shoreline area, and the yellow strip is the second 150 feet. I turned on, in this slide, I turned on the wetlands layer. You can see down here at the bottom, there's class 2 wetland mapped around Crystal Lake. So you can see, you know, just as a screening tool to give you an idea, oh, there are definitely mapped wetlands here. Not all wetlands are mapped. So again, if you're concerned that you might be in a wetland, you should reach out. You can zoom in further. You can use this to take measurements. There's lots of great tools in here. You can look at the slope of a parcel on the Natural Resources Atlas. So this is a really great tool. Wastewater permitting, just, you know, if you are increasing the number of bedrooms, replacing failed systems, you might need a wastewater permit. So just be aware those often go together with redeveloping shoreland properties. So you'll need to reach out to the wastewater permitting program. Stormwater usually does not apply to most of these lakeshore properties because it's usually on larger parcels, but you know, maybe a handful a year. So if you're disturbing more than an acre of land, if it's a very large project, then it might need stormwater permitting. And then finally, the most common question I get is, well, what happens if I don't get a permit or I don't comply with my permit? And so we have an environmental enforcement program. There are regional environmental enforcement officers around the state. Our first step is, if we get a complaint or if we become aware that a project is out of compliance, our primary goal is to get that person back into compliance. That might be restoration requirements. It could be that that person did a project that could have gotten a permit and they just didn't get one. So we would require after the fact permitting. We might require the removal of a project or the modification of the project, and then some combination of all of these. So you have to modify your project, do some restoration, and then do after the fact permitting. So our first step is compliance. And then depending on the factors of the case, the investigation, if it was just an honest mistake and the person fixed everything right away, sometimes we just close the case. Sometimes it's a little more complicated and that person gets some sort of penalty or ticket. And then if it's even more complex, they end up in environmental court, and those take years of time, and usually the fines are much larger. So that's kind of the reason we really try to push people to work with us first, ask questions first so that you can stay in compliance. And then we have our regional model. So these are the folks that you can reach out to depending on where you are with your questions. And I encourage contractors, residents, realtors, everybody, town municipal folks to reach out to us. We're happy to work with you. Okay, that's all I've got. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. We have one question in the chat. And if anyone else is interested in asking a question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. First up, are the one-to-one replacement trees generally required to be planted near the shoreline?
Yeah, I have to say every parcel is different and has different constraints, but our goal is to try to get trees as close as possible to the water. There is some language in the Shoreline Protection Act that says that the vegetation replacement be functionally equivalent. So if you're proposing to remove a tree that's 150 feet from the water, we want it to be at least that close and maybe closer. We usually start off with trying to increase the buffer. But the one thing that we definitely we try not to authorize is if somebody has to cut down a bunch of trees really close to the water for a project and then they want to replant all the trees at the far end non-lake side of their property. We're looking for something that's more functionally equivalent. So the exact details differ from property to property depending on what's there, but we try to get as close to the water as possible, at least closer than what was authorized to be removed.
Okay, another question. When does a rock or boulder in terms of size placed within 100 feet of the mean water level become impervious surface?
Yeah, so it doesn't really. The definition of impervious surface in the statute is human-made material. So dry laid natural stone, like a dry laid natural stone wall, is considered to be pervious. Similarly, which this is kind of counterintuitive, bare rock, ledge is not counted as impervious. It's just counted as cleared area, even though we know water can't flow through it. It's just the delineation made in the statute is that once you switch over to the man-made materials, that's when it becomes impervious. So concrete blocks are impervious. Dry laid natural stone is not.
All right. Any other questions for Laura? All right.
Well, thanks everybody. I know regulations can be a little bit of a snooze, but still an important component to all the work that you guys do out there.
It was great. All right, so in our schedule right now, we have a 15-minute break. So go get some coffee, take a bathroom break, stretch your legs, and we'll be back here at 10:30 for our panel discussion. All right, folks, it is 10:30, so we're going to return here and get started with our panel discussion. So, how this is going to work is we have 3 panelists for you today who are each going to give a short presentation about a case study of a real world project that they have worked on recently. And then feel free to ask questions, during the presentations or after, or save them to the end and we'll ask all 3 presenters questions at the end. So without further delay then, we're going to go in the same order we went in on Wednesday for the presenters. So we're going to start with Meg Carter, who is the Conservation Science Director at the Northwoods Stewardship Center in Charleston, Vermont. Meg's main focus has been the implementation of water quality and wildlife habitat improvement projects, but she has also dabbled in hazard mitigation planning, tactical basin planning, and invasive species management. So Meg, if you're on the call, you can get ready to share your presentation. I'm just going to introduce everyone right now. So our second presenter will be Patrick Hurley, who is the project manager for the Memphremagog Watershed Association and the owner of Windenwater LLC, an environmental consulting firm. Mr. Hurley has worked in the fields of ecological design, watershed restoration, and sediment and erosion control for 13 years. In both roles, Patrick's work focuses on assessing, designing, permitting, and constructing natural resource restoration projects above and below the waterline. He enjoys using tools such as topographic surveys, GIS, CAD, and hydrologic modeling to aid in the design and planning process. And our third presenter will be Holly Greenleaf, who is an ecological landscape designer and the owner of Greenleaf Design LLC, a small design, build, and education business based out of Huntington, Vermont. She has worked in landscape design and horticultural fields for over a decade and specializes in native plantings, shoreland restoration, stormwater management, illustration, and other types of landscape visualization. Holly was raised as a farmer and gardener in the Northeast Kingdom and loves to dig in the soil and observe plants in their natural habitats. So, is Meg here on the call? Oh, yep, there she is. All right, great. It's all yours, Meg.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison. All right, let's see. I'm gonna need you to tell me if you can see this.
Yep, looks good.
Great, cool, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Crystal Lake Shoreline Restoration Project that we did up at Crystal Lake State Park in Barton, Vermont. It was a really fun project and a great group of partners, including the Orleans County Natural Resources Conservation District, DEC, FPR, VHCB, and Northwoods. And I'll talk a bit about that. But first, I want to talk about where we were. So you can see here on the map of Vermont, we were up in the Northeast Kingdom, just east of Route 91 in Barton, and up at the very tippy top of Crystal Lake, which Laura showed earlier, actually. We have Crystal Lake State Park, and our project was right here on this point at the outlet stream of Crystal Lake that heads northwards. I'm going to show you the last chapter of the book first, which is a before and after, so you get to see what the issues were that we were trying to correct and mitigate. So you can see that we've got this fairly steep eroding shoreline area here. This is a result of several things, primarily ice push, but also it's heavily impacted by foot traffic. This is a highly used state park day use area for swimming and recreating and barbecuing on the beach. So you can see there's this steep area, and then there's also these tree roots hanging out over here from these birches over here. So we wanted to try to save this birch. And so here is what it looks like afterwards. You can see we did a variety of bioengineering controls on the shore itself, including adding some coconut fiber materials, stone toe here. You can see quite a bit of stakes. That was a lot of sledge hammering. You can see the fence up here. And over here by the birch, you can see that those roots are no longer poking out. It is instead surrounded by some lovely topsoil. In this video, I'm going to talk about the lead up to the project implementation, the partners, the design, the implementation itself, which was my main role in this project. We'll go over the budget for the project, which is always very interesting, and then we'll talk a little bit about outcomes and lessons learned. So that's me right there. And then that's Patrick, who will talk to you next. And this is Ben Copans hiding off to the side here. So how did we get here? It started off with a lake-wise assessment from Alison in, I believe you said 2022. So that's where it all started. That developed several recommendations based on current condition and the ideal look for the finished product, the function of that shoreline to try to help improve water quality in Crystal Lake. So that's the project idea, the seed planted there, and then the planning continued from there, which included identifying partners, identifying potential funding sources, identifying designers. And so the design was actually done in-house at the state with Eddie Haynes doing the design and also working on the permitting. Sarah Demzel at the Orleans County Natural Resources Conservation District received funding from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board to do a lot of the work, including project management and implementation. And that's what we ended up doing at Northwoods in partnership with Vermont Parks. So here are the lovely partners: DEC, Lakewise, FPR. This is Tracy, Jack, and Eddie. Tracy and Jack are Parks employees. Jack is their maintenance technician, and Tracy, I believe, is the Northern Regional Parks coordinator. I really should have looked up her title before this, but they were both amazing. All three of them were amazing on this project. And then also Orleans County Natural Resources Conservation District was the primary partner funding this project. And so there's Sarah and Eddie there on site talking about the project. And then there's us, Northwoods Stewardship Center, the Conservation Science Department, and our Conservation Services crew and riparian lands crews both teamed up to help implement this project. And there they are on the ground right there. Our project funder for the implementation of this project was the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. They're the clean water service provider for the Memphremagog Watershed. So in partnership with VHCB and the Basin Water Quality Council, they provided the funding that helped get this project on the ground. Here's the design by Eddie Haynes. He's with the Water Investment Division at the Department of Environmental Conservation. There's several pieces to this project. From here, this little section here is a coir log area where we laid down some stone toe, some log, and backfilled with soil and then planted. Similar here, but we left this walking path for access to the lake, recreational access to the lake, because this is still a day use area, and we don't want to change that. We just want to make it a little more lake friendly. There's more coir log laid down here, and then over on this section right here, this is encapsulated soil lifts because we're going for a little bit of a steeper slope, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. This here is the close-up of the encapsulated soil lift area, and then this is the close-up of the coir log area. So there's a bit of a difference between encapsulated soil lifts and fiber coir rolls, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But generally, encapsulated soil lifts, the way we did them here, Patrick has a different method that he'll talk about a little bit later, but the material comes as a block, which is sort of squared off. It's not round, so it has a directionality to it. And then it comes with a blanket attached, a coconut blanket attached to it. And that allows you to gain height on your practice without losing integrity. So you use these generally for slopes that are a little bit steeper. Fiber coir rolls are more for protecting the toe of a slope, the base of a slope, that may be at an angle of repose. It could be a 4-to-1. But the encapsulated soil lifts, you can end up with a 1-to-1 slope or a 2-to-1 slope and maintain your integrity while the root systems are establishing in that practice. So there's a bit of a difference, and this is a good project to see that on. So later today, I'm going to go over the step-by-step for installing an encapsulated soil lift, but here are the basic steps. You're going to move some soil, lay down some geotextile and a stone toe as a base for your practice and a protection measure for your practice. Then you lay down your Bio-D blocks, which are that coconut material that I was talking about, an erosion control blanket inside your Bio-D block, backfilled with soil. You're going to tuck things together, fold things and stake things back until you have sort of a soil taco that's surrounded by blanket. And then you're going to repeat that. This is a modular practice, so it can be adapted to be as wide and generally as tall as you'd like, although I do believe there are limits to the height. I haven't encountered them, but I imagine that there would be. And then you're also going to be doing planting, seeding, watering, and fencing to give it root systems that will establish within the soil. Give it a drink because plants need that, and then fence it to remove that foot traffic pressure that you're going to see on these practices that can be really detrimental to the settling in of your practice. So this is that close-up again of the encapsulated soil lift section. You can see the roots are trying to be incorporated into this and trying to be protected by this. Down here, you see the mean water level and the ordinary high water level for Crystal Lake, and that the stone toe is covered by both of those and goes a little bit above it even. You don't want these encapsulated soil lifts or your bioengineered materials to be sitting in water consistently, constantly. You want water to flow through them, and you don't want them to be sitting there, as I said on Wednesday, like a tea bag. So you can see this squared off Bio-D block here, and then back here is where you backfill the soil to create these lifts. And this was a two-course encapsulated soil lift project, as well as a two-course coir log project. So this is sort of the before and after on the encapsulated soil lift section specifically. You can see that we have these two courses, and here sort of as we're getting wider between the courses, that's where we're going to start switching between the Bio-D block and the coir log, because there's really no need for the Bio-D block. Those blankets only extend 4 feet back from the block. So when you start getting wider than that, it just makes a lot more sense money-wise, logistically, functionally, to have the coir log instead. This stone toe down here, you can see, this is to protect the practice, to raise the practice, provide a solid base for it, and also to protect it from ice push, which was identified as an issue on this project, on this lake. So these down here are designed to aim ice up and over the practice instead of pushing into it and lifting it up. And then down here underneath this log, you can kind of see that we placed some plants. We put some potted plants under there. So the root ball is underneath the lift and in contact with soil, and also getting watered generally. And then they will hopefully root and spread their roots into that hillside and help hold that together against future erosion. This is a close-up of the coir log section. And I really like this drawing because it shows pretty well the role of the erosion control blanket in this. You've got your stone toe here. You can see the ordinary high water level is up to the stone toe, but not much above. We did set these down, not into the water as this shows, but a little bit above in a little trench. So you dig out a little trench, you lay down your log, and then you stake it in a particular pattern that I'll show you later, and you put in your plants behind it. You plant the plants directly into the erosion control blanket. You can pull the blanket apart a little bit if it's a small plant, or you can even cut a cross in your blanket to plant a larger plant. And then you tack that back down with, we used bioplastic, biodegradable pegs, but you can use landscape staples. They also make wooden pegs that you can use, which are really nice. except they kind of fall apart when you hammer them, so they're not for the rockier soils. This is the coir log that we used. This is actually the project that we used it on. This is the Crystal Lake project here. And you can see there's a particular pattern that you put your stakes in at to hold the log in place. So you take your stake and you slip it through. You can see this coir net around the fiber material. You put your stake through that net and then hammer it in until it's a few inches above the top of your log. And then you take this natural fiber rope, you tie it in this pattern like this, zigzag, zigzag. The water is out here. And this is a side view of the stake. So you got your pointy end down here, and then you have this notch here, and that's where you put your natural fiber rope. Once you've got that sort of zigzag net in place, then you hammer down each of these stakes again individually to sort of suction down onto your log and hold it in place. We also tie together the ends of the logs so that we're trying not to create these weak points between the logs. We really smush them together, tie them together, and then stake them all down into place to hold them where they're at. This is our pile of coir logs. You can see it is quite large. We also have this one up here is a Bio-D block, but most of these are all coir logs. We actually over-ordered materials on this project, and I'll talk a little bit about that in lessons learned too. This is the team tying together the logs and setting it into our dug trench here on top of the erosion control blanket. So you dig your trench, you lay down your blanket, you put your log into the trench, tie it together, stake it in place, and then you take your erosion control blanket and kind of flop it over the log. And that allows you to backfill soil up to the top of the log and create a nice growing area behind your log that the material will hold together as those roots establish into a nice root system on your shore. Then everything is staked back with those bioplastic pegs that I was talking about. And your bioengineered materials here are designed to eventually biodegrade. The hope is that it will take them long enough that the roots will become established before that happens. And so you can see this is our second course of coir logs on this project area. Here's a review of the design here. You can see the coir log areas here, encapsulated soil lift area here, and here's again that finished product. This is the small area on the other side of this walking path here, and then this is the larger area, and this right here is around where it transitions to encapsulated soil lifts rather than the coir logs. It was a lot of stake pounding. There are so many stakes. I think we put in probably 7 per log, and there was, I think there was something like 30 something logs, coir logs. Anyway, it was a whole lot of stakes and a whole lot of stake pounding, which takes much more time and energy than it seems like, especially when probably every 5th or 6th stake decided to split on us. So lesson learned there. We actually have a gas-powered post pounder that we wish we had brought instead of sledging, but that's lessons learned. A little bit about the budget and costs of this particular project. OCNRCD did the project management and got some permitting costs. I believe the permitting applications were actually done by Eddie at DEC, but the permit fees themselves were part of our grant budget. And so OCNRCD put together the grant budget, put in the application for the grant and received it and held it from BHCB. Northwoods crew costs, our daily labor rate for our hand tools and oversight of the project. We have a lot of experience installing this type of project, and so that is part of the value of what we provide. And then the state parks, they provided equipment, the excavator operation, and tractoring. They were there every day. Jack was there every day, letting us into the bathroom, unlocking the bathroom facilities. running the tractor, running the excavator. They also provided materials and the delivery of that material. And then Eddie did the design for the project and did quite a bit of site visits and design and project implementation oversight or assistance, so he could be there to help us decipher design pieces and put them into reality. And then there was other materials and equipment that were needed for implementing the project. This is the original grant budget here. You can see there's the coir logs, the erosion control blanket here, sod staples. There's a few things that we didn't use. We didn't end up using the jute roll. We didn't use quite so many Bio-D blocks or coir logs. We used a little bit more rope than anticipated. We got a little bit more stone than we thought we were going to. I think we did get about that much topsoil, but anyway, there were quite a few plants that we put in. We budgeted for 165, I think, shrubs, and then we ended up getting 173, and then 120 grass plugs. Only 50 or 60 switchgrass plugs were available, so we ended up doing a mix of switchgrass and blue stem, little blue stem. The wildflower seed cost about that. I think we ended up with a bulk discount or something like that. And then the community engagement sign has yet to be completed, so we're not sure exactly about that one. The labor provided, Parks estimated that they would use about 5,000. 1 week of Northwoods labor costs about 7,900. And then project oversight match in this column was estimated at 1,560 and 1,200 from David Webb and Eddie Haynes. And then project management and coordination, etc., from OCNRCD was estimated at 1950, and then community sign design, etc., 520. Down here, we estimated 1 day of excavator use. We ended up using 5. Luckily, that was in the match column, but definitely better from experience now, knowing that, to estimate high on how much excavator time you're going to need. The silt fence, we estimated $500 match. Northwoods has a short section of silt fence or a turbidity curtain, but we ended up borrowing, I think, 250 feet worth from the town of Wilmington, and it had just been sitting around in their road crew shed, so they were delighted to get it out of there, and we may end up holding on to that for a while. So a cool thing to come out of this project, in addition to the project itself. And then there's the permitting costs down here at the bottom. This is some of the actuals that we ended up seeing. 7,900, that held strong. We added in some time for my direct supervision of the project, which ended up being a lot more than I had anticipated. Shrubs, other materials, grass plugs, sod staples, that all ended up coming out a little bit under what we had expected, which is great. Staff time and equipment from Parks and materials from Parks ended up coming out a bit above what we had anticipated. We don't have a complete accounting of the OCNRCD costs, so we just ended up keeping what they had estimated here for the grant budget. So overall, total project cost seems to have been, not final numbers, but seems to have been about $35,000, which is pretty dang close to what we had ended up budgeting in the first place, although there was some shifting between lines. We were about 2,000 over budget, but the majority of that was in the match column. So that's not bad. Here's some lessons learned from this project. For timing and project flow, we had a Tuesday morning educational workshop, which only gave us Monday really to get our ducks in a row. And there are always hiccups right at the beginning of a project. So our ducks were not quite in a row for Tuesday morning. in terms of a hands-on workshop. So in the future, I would think maybe a Wednesday morning workshop might be for the best, or if it's going to be hands-on, yeah, I would say give it a couple days into the project to make sure that there's enough to do for hands-on learning. Turbidity curtain install and removal always takes longer than I expect. So planning on that the Friday before the start of the project is great. That needs to be in before the first grain of sand is moved. So you want to start your excavation before the hand tool crew actually starts. So we sometimes have been starting hand tool crews on Tuesday and having the excavator start Monday, which tends to work out. There's less waiting around, hanging around idle hands. Remember that we have a gas-powered post pounder and use it. That's critical. I really want to do that next time. It was our first year having that. We had some trial uses, and we knew that it was useful for one particular project type. We definitely could have used it for this one, and we will definitely be doing that in the future. Order extra materials, but not that much extra. We ended up having to buy a storage container in order to store all the extra materials that we have from this project. So we have quite a few coir logs left, quite a few bio-D blocks left. I think we even have several hundred of those notched stakes, which we'll be using for future projects, and also may have available if partners end up needing some of that material as well. Don't panic about your pile of rock. Rock piles are easily disappeared into a project, but they also seem to go longer than I ever realize. Lesson learned, don't panic. Be flexible with plants. There are some plants that you just can't find available based on what nurseries are growing right now. There was one project where we couldn't find fox sedge, which is pretty common, but it was sold out in all the places that we checked. There's review guidance. Apparently there's some guidance coming out around switchgrass and whether it can be used in these projects, the use of rare, threatened, and endangered species, or species that are on watch lists. Definitely do not use any invasive species. Always budget in extra. So if you're budgeting a year out, budget in extra. Always budget in a contingency fund, because there's always going to be some unintended thing that happens. And if there's not, great. But if there is and you didn't plan for it, oops. Also, there's a social aspect to this, which is when we put out our turbidity curtain, we sparked accidentally rumors that the outlet stream was going to be dredged. And so there was a little bit of PR needed, a little bit of community outreach needed to let people know, whether they were excited or quite angry, that we were not, in fact, there to be dredging the river at all, and that we were just doing some shoreline work to try to help improve water quality. All right, that is all I have. Thank you. Here's my contact info if you have any questions for after the fact that show up tomorrow. But other than that, that's all I have.
Thank you, Meg. That was great. We do have one question in the chat right now, and if anybody else has questions for Meg, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. The one question that was in the chat was, why was your public access to the lake not winding? We talked about the importance of winding paths to the water earlier today.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And given a round 2, I might have pushed for that, but as it is, we were contending with a high use public area. The winding paths are could have been a PR obstacle, but it's a good question. We potentially should have, and we may push designers for that in the future. In this case, Alison, do you have any insider knowledge on that?
Well, that opening was not part of the original design. I think that was a request that came kind of at the last minute from maybe from the park to have an access area, so that might have been contributing to it. It's also you could maybe put a winding path in there, but it's a pretty small buffer. So I mean, I think because this was a state park, that's really the reason that this access was created the way that it was. And
Yeah,
taking
this was
landowner
also,
needs into consideration is important.
yeah, it was also an existing, you could tell that it was an existing pathway that people had been traveling for a long time. So yeah, various reasons. Was it the best? Probably not. But was it the best we could do? Probably.
We do
Well,
have one other question here that says, what percentage of your plants survived? I know those plants just went in this fall, so maybe you don't have an answer yet, but what would your
yeah,
estimate be, I guess?
impossible to say. So they have, when we put them in, it was just this past September. And so there's no telling until next year. And we'll definitely be going out next year to see what level of survival we think we have. But at this point, it's really hard to tell. Schrodinger's 100%.
Great, let's hope. Another question, why use bio-D blocks instead of throwing a coir log filled with whatever you want at the leading edge and wrap the matting over it to make the lift?
That's actually the method that Patrick has used, and his really cool video later will show them using that method. There's multiple ways of doing it, and this is just the way that we have done it in the past and are used to doing it. The bio-D block that we use has that blanket attached. It's directional. It has kind of a square edge to hold it in place. No real justification there except to say that both equally valid methods of creating these encapsulated soil lifts, and we chose this one.
All right, that's all the questions from the chat right now. If people think of things they want to ask Meg, you can still have time to ask questions at the end of these 3 presentations. So thank you, Meg. And next up, we have Patrick Hurley from the Memphremagog Watershed Association.
Thank you, Alison and Meg. Well done. Let me make sure my slideshow works for everybody. You all seeing that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we gave this talk on Wednesday, and Alison had already forgiven me for using an example that is not on a lakeshore, but rather a river. So I'd like to show a few kind of case studies of projects that I've designed and implemented on rivers and lakes using a variety of bioengineering practices. And I have a GIF, a video, hopefully on Zoom or Teams. It isn't too glitchy, so we'll get a chance to see the construction and assembly of one of these projects in a time-lapse fashion. So just to give you some context, this is up in Morgan, Vermont on a stream bank management area owned by Fish and Wildlife Department. This is our pre-site, our pre-project condition. You can see there's a big old flood that had just come through this project. You can see that nice kind of high water line at the toe of the valley wall. We had this really bad road, this kind of heinous ditch, and a culvert that was about 20% of the diameter that it should have been for the size of the stream. And you can see that it gets overwhelmed, it gets flanked, blows out, causes a lot of erosion. So this project, among many other restoration actions, like reconnecting an alluvial fan and a bunch of woody structure additions, we also removed this culvert and restored the stream crossing, rebuilt the stream banks with soil lifts, created some floodplain wetlands on either side of the river where the road used to be. We obliterated the road, and we also created a constructed riffle so that we could have stable grade control, but also fish passage and some nice habitat. So I'm going to see if this works for y'all, and hopefully you can see it rolling through. We have essentially at this point removed the culvert. We have placed large wood underneath the channels, embedded in the channel. It acts as grade control perpendicularly across the channel. There's 2 large root wads that are essentially sitting underneath the stream banks that we are now reconstructing. The riffle has been constructed, and we are building the banks back from essentially the low water line. So there's some nice bony rock underneath that first soil lift. And what we do on rivers is I like to use this continual roll approach where the Bio-D blocks are, 8 feet long or whatnot, and you kind of got to make them kind of like Lincoln logs. Well, this approach, you can use a continuous roll of fabric. There's no tying except when you get to the end of the roll. So every 100 feet, you have to have an overlap. And we use coconut logs, coir logs as our tow for each lift. The fabric we use on the outside is about 900 series coir. It's resistant to like 10 feet per second flow velocity, so it's pretty robust, but it's really coarse. There's big gauge holes in this fabric, so we actually line the inside of each lift with straw filter fabric, erosion control blanket, and that kind of keeps the fine materials in the lift while everything's starting to revegetate and kind of stabilize. So you can see this is the last lift going up. There's our filter fabric that keeps the fines inside. We place the log where we want it. Step back from the bank. You can do 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1. Kind of terracing or staggering. Usually just go 1.5-to-1 or 2-to-1. You can see we're backfilling behind the log with our native material. This is really good soil. You can see it's black earth. It's black gold. It's not sandy, gravelly, bony material. It's a lot of loam and really heavy moisture holding material, which really kind of makes a mess while you're doing the job, but it's really good for getting willows to grow. So one thing I want to emphasize is that in between each lift, when we place those willows down on top of the fabric, before we place the willows on that fabric, we add a skiff of dirt. You want an inch or two of dirt in between each layer of soil lift, because if you're putting potted plants, or in this case, willow cuttings, those things have to be in contact with soil. If they're in contact with this coconut fabric and they're not completely inundated in water, they're going to desiccate. They're going to dry out and they're likely going to die. I'm going to pause right here if I can figure out how to do that. We got our nice big key rock right there. At the end of each lift, we like to tie it in, key it into the banks, upstream and downstream, or if you're on a lake, really extend away from the shoreline back towards the land and key that end corner in, because one ice push, one flood, it could hook that corner and yank the whole thing out. So the keying in at the end is really important. It's really key, as they say, right? We would come back and trim these willows a little flush with the ends of those assemblies up, and I just skipped too far. So let me get back to where we were. Putting one last, still a little bit too much. Where's that rock? So there we are, staking in the last lift. That's gonna be at our finished grade, more or less. We'll put 3 inches of dirt on top of that when we're done, seed it, mulch it, make it nice and stabilized. And the key is that you want those willows to be in contact with soil. They need to have a bit of an angle to them. Even 2% of an angle is enough for that cutting to know which way is up. And then it will sprout roots at the appropriate end, and it'll sprout shoots at the appropriate end. If you put them sloping down, they're likely to not root or shoot out. So another important thing about the willows is that you want at least 60, ideally 75% of it embedded in the ground. And over time, the willows really start to become the permanent stability, in this case willows, sometimes other species, but permanent stability factor. The logs and the fabric, they'll last 3, 5, 6 years, but eventually they will become swallowed by the earth, you could say, and really just biodegrade. The logs are there to hold moisture, allow vegetation to establish, provide some micro habitat and water holding capacity for those young plants. But ideally, they will become consumed by the vegetation, and we're off to a pretty good start. This is what the project looked like right after we finished. You can see both sides of the river. This is where the culvert used to be, our new constructed riffle. We haven't trimmed these willow sticks yet, but you can see we've kind of trimmed everything flush. Leave a little bit exposed. You don't need much exposed. A terminal bud or two is really all you want. Anything more than that, it's just prone to dry out and kill the plant. Keep an eye on that vertical habitat tree that we plucked in the ground. You can see this soil lift is permanently wet. I mean, so we connected an alluvial fan that then kind of sneaks behind here and spills over behind the soil lift. You can see our obliterated road coming down. These soil lifts were saturated all the time, which is ideal. It's a great situation because it really provides like a robust planting or germination or, you know, just ideal conditions for vegetation, especially willows to grow. You can see just how much water sits behind this floodplain wetland. You can see after some floods that we had, you know, we're getting really good substrate deposition on those tiers. The willows are still dormant at this point, so they don't have any leaves on them. But you know, that's great germination substrate for wetland emergent species or rhizomatous vegetation to kind of creep in. You can see in the winter, this is the first winter, you know, they just get bludgeoned by the ice and they handle it pretty well. There's obviously going to be some frost heaving, so sometimes they'll settle or heave a little bit. You can see some more willow cuttings coming out at an angle, but also coming out vertically. That next spring, we're getting really good regen from those cuttings that are poking out. You can see the fabric's holding up well. You can see we still got some bony stone toe in that riffle, so nothing's scouring out from beneath. Just remember when you're building lifts, don't build them perfectly flat. Build them canting backwards, sloped away from the river down into the ground. It's ideal to have it, if it's going to settle, you want to settle more flat and not settle so that it's pitching into the river or into the lake. So always build them with a little bit of a back lean. There's that log again. This is right after a 1,000-year flood that we got in Morgan this past summer. You can see we got a lot of willows that are still holding on, poking out of our soil lifts. You can just see the top log right there. So the river's up almost 3 feet at this stage. And you can see this grass, all this emergent vegetation. This has all come in 1 year. You can't even tell that there was a road there anymore. And the soil lifts have held up. Those key stones that we put in the corners where we tucked in the lifts haven't gotten plucked out, haven't gotten washed away, haven't scoured. Everything's really coming in nice and strong. You can see a lot of willows on the opposite bank. They're a little bent, a little beat up, but they love it, you know. They love getting kind of thrashed around, and if they get bent over and stay down but aren't totally broken, they will just continue to root and grow up from there. So it's almost like a creeping vine in that sense that, you know, willows are built for this sort of abuse. Another practice we use is getting away from materials that we got to bring in from Sri Lanka that sometimes may be fabricated with child labor, you know, so using a ton of, you know, erosion control, coir products from across the globe isn't the most sustainable or perhaps ethical thing to do. So we try to diversify and use different materials. And so lakes love wood. Naturally, lakes will recruit a lot of wood, driftwood, woody debris, down trees, overhanging trees, sinking logs. And in general, when you have a large body of water with a lot of wind, those logs will rack up on the shoreline. These are two examples from places that I've come across, and you just see fantastic arrays of woody debris that are just perfect habitat for critters and really solid shoreline protection. And we've removed a lot of wood. Even just this summer, you know, lots of floods happened in our area, Northeast Kingdom. A lot of woody material flowed down into the lakes, and God bless their hearts, but a lot of lake associations immediately sought to pull that material out of the river, out of the lakes. And while, you know, sure, trash and other debris that isn't particularly natural should be yanked out, by removing all that woody material, you're removing habitat, you're removing substrate, you're removing protection of the shoreline. And so it's really important to let the wood lie, let it be on the shoreline. It is nature's, you know, first line of defense. So we have a project on Shadow Lake that we designed and implemented just this past summer, and it's essentially a very micro scale driftwood log stabilization approach. We had a whole suite of other practices like buffer plantings and an infiltration trench and stabilized access area. But for this purpose, we're just focusing on the logs you see in that little red ellipse. So the reason we wanted to put logs in this one spot is because we had some really nice cedar trees, this little hedge right here, and they were starting to get beat up from the ice and the wind and the waves, and we don't want to lose them. If these trees go down, they're going to yank that bank apart. They're likely going to have to get cleaned out because, just the way the landowner manages the property and aesthetics. So we wanted to protect those root systems as best as we could. This is not a spot where I would have recommended soil lifts. You'd make way more of a mess than any benefit you would gain. So our approach was like, let's just try to protect the toe of this bank. Let's try to prevent further erosion and root dieback. You can see there's some cedars and a pine that's coming in. We'd love to be able to work around those plants so that they can continue to grow and thrive. And so there's a couple different options. Like when you're talking about using wood and bioengineering, most people think of root wrap, stream banks, or brush banks, brush fascines, deflector jams, those sorts of things. So these are some examples, where people essentially are using embedded logs, so half buried, partially buried, ballast in terms of stones. Sometimes you'll get like, plan set that's got two large boulders that are connected like a daisy chain with, a piece of chain or cable that's epoxied to the stone, and essentially just like lay that over some key logs to hold them down. Driven piles sometimes are used. We weren't going to do that here on the lake. It doesn't get super high energy flows, but it is subjected to, water fluctuations from dam management activities, and also ice. So we wanted something that was soft stabilization, that was also dynamic, could move, take a beating, and then maybe sit back down in its original position. So we went with this kind of, earth anchor based log revetment idea. So we call it driftwood, but we essentially were able to secure a bunch of flood debris wood from a culvert in Holland, where we went over there with some logging equipment, two log trucks and a skidder and a crane, and we yanked all this material out of a culvert after a flood, brought it to our project staging area, and we've been pulling out of that pile for our restoration projects for the past year. And it's great material. It's like power washed, clean, no invasive species, no bark, no dirt on the root crowns. It's really ideal stuff. And so we were going to use those, and we need to secure them at the toe of that bank, right as you see here in the schematic, just to protect the vegetation, protect the cedars, protect the soil profile from ice and wind and waves. And to do that, we essentially anchored them with what's called duckbill anchors. They're driven earth anchors attached to wire rope cables. You drive them 3, 4, 5 feet in the ground, and then you pull load on the cable that activates the anchor. Instead of being driven in horizontally or vertically, it then activates and essentially creates this big anchor, right? Then we have 2 anchors that then loop through the log. So we whole hog through the log, ideally at the root ball, and then at the top of the stem, the crown. So no matter what, each log got at least 2 anchors, one on each end, and at each anchoring point, there were 2 duckbills installed. So you'd have, if one anchor gave out at the root ball, you'd still have another anchor at the root ball holding on. Same thing at the tip of the bowl. So each log essentially had 4 duckbills, sometimes more. We also interlaced the logs so that they would be kind of interlocked behind the root wads, into the roots. Some logs were propped up in between the existing cedars to act as a fulcrum point or a wedge point. You can see here we're installing an earth anchor right here. There's our driving rod. It's terrible work. You always hit rocks. You got to, really poke around for that ideal place to install your anchor. But these duckbill 68s have several thousand pounds of load. And so the idea is that they're not super secure. They are positioned and they are fastened in place so that they don't drift away and cause problems, but they are dynamic. So if the water comes up, they'll kind of bob in place. If an ice sheet flows over and whacks into it, they'll deflect. They won't try to fight or resist. They will protect and deflect. You can also see that we've got a lot of really good vegetation that is coming up that we really want to protect further. And so it really seats nicely in between those shrubs and those little seedlings and trees that are coming up. So this is close to finish on that bank. We've got some stone protection over here, but really the key part was underneath these cedars. And so we really went heavy at that water line, installing them. I think there's probably 25 earth anchors in this section of the bank. And then this is a photo from Monday morning. The water level in Shadow Lake has actually dropped quite a bit right now because the dam is failing, and so they're patching that up and had to drop the water level. But you can see they're still in place. They haven't gone anywhere. They really look naturalized. Like I said, they've been power washed in a flood, so they look like driftwood. They're still structurally intact. There's some bark blown off and some cracks in them, but that's okay. You don't need perfectly uniform dimensional lumber to do this. And ideally the materials are sourced responsibly. So that's what they look like now. They've got about 6 months of exposure in the lake since we've installed them. We're really going to be monitoring this approach because it's pretty cost effective. It's pretty natural. It's very low invasive, work. You're not really disturbing the soil profile much. It definitely required encroachment permit and Army Corps permit, but it was relatively painless. And we hope to be doing more of these projects where it makes sense on other, vulnerable shorelines where there's ideal vegetation that doesn't need to be disturbed just to patch some erosion. So that's kind of like two examples of relatively sheer banks. They're not super tall, but they are almost vertical banks. And sometimes that's what we deal with because that's what's most prone to erosion. But other times you get those low angle shorelines that might be getting like really hammered by ice push berms. They might have no solid vegetation on them, just turf grass or something. I think of kind of alluvial fans or deltas where a brook will come down into a lake and you'll get these sort of flat plain sort of landforms that maybe they're not vegetated because a whole slug of sand and sediment came down. Maybe they're just getting scoured away, and you might want to stabilize that material so it doesn't continue to wash or mobilize. And so this is an example from Flathead Lake from many years ago. We are essentially this lake has really high water level fluctuations, which if you're working on a dam operated lake or dam managed lake, or if you're working on a reservoir in particular, reservoirs are really vulnerable to shoreline erosion because one, they weren't used to having water levels that high, and two, the water levels fluctuate dramatically. So this is an example of that. This shoreline was getting really bludgeoned by ice and wave erosion, and so we use a whole slew of bioengineering approaches. This is what we call a brush mattress, a willow mattress. It's kind of like a fascine, but it's more linear feature. They're laying flat. They're not bundled. So they're making contact with some topsoil. We would then also spread topsoil on top of them, a couple inches on top of these cuttings. Those are actually live stakes that are driven in between the cuttings. And then we are tethering between each vertical live stake to try to kind of pin them in place. This is what the project looked like immediately afterwards. It's been planted. Here's our willow mattress that's partially buried at the end. Again, just a little bit of a slope, 2% slope. Those willows will know which way is up. And the vast majority of that cutting is in contact with the soil, which is important. This soil is pretty good. It was moist, so it was conducive to growing. You can see Meg's kind of example of the staggered driven post to keep this coir log in place. That's like the second line of defense. The first line of defense is a little bit of a stone toe over here that has been placed to protect a kind of a mucky, peaty area that has been covered with erosion control fabric and seeded. You can see, look at that driftwood. That's what we want to see, some driftwood. All the fencing is just geese deterrent. That comes out after year 1 or 2. But this is what it looked like after a year. We had a lot of willow regenerate. All of this kind of silvery green coming up, that's all new willow shoot. This is a planted shrub, but we're getting a lot of herbaceous, a lot of woody vegetation coming in. Our stone toe has really remained in place. Our driftwood hasn't gone anywhere. So, stabilization shoreline isn't just limited to those sheer banks. There are lots of opportunities to revegetate shallow areas so that you can improve habitat, enhance habitat, create new habitat where some of these deltas or these gravel bars have been forming after our floods. And I keep telling lake associations when I meet with them, like, keep your eyes on those deltas at the mouth of the brooks. That is where the knotweed is going to start. That is where the yellow iris or the phragmites is going to start. And I would encourage, DEC and others in that regulatory world to allow, active vegetation or revegetation of those new deposits, just because they are a breeding ground for aggressive invasive species. Just for, food for thought, there's a lot of other options out there. I'm a big believer in live cuttings, as long as they're built well. This one fella who I've been following for over a decade, his name is David Polster. He's out of British Columbia. He kind of is the guru in steep slope stabilization using like fascines and willow wattles. There's all sorts of iterations you can tweak for the different site conditions. So just do some exploring in terms of that. There's other ways to stabilize shorelines. We don't necessarily have to use soil lifts, or sorry, fabric encapsulated soil lifts all the time. We can use more woody revetment soil lifts, brush bank soil lifts. So this is kind of a step-by-step for bank protection using buried wood, brush, and live staking. So there's a lot of different variations that you can do with these approaches. The materials are pretty transferable. As I mentioned, I'm a rivers person, but I've taken a lot of that experience into the lakeshore realm, because where I work in the Northeast Kingdom, we're drowning in lakes. So it's transferable. There are certain things you got to be careful about in terms of the soil texture. If you're dealing with clay, it's going to frost, it's going to heave, it's going to expand, it's going to do weird things. It's not going to compact well when you want it to compact, but it's going to be more compact than you'll ever experience in your life if you're trying to dig straight through fresh stuff or undisturbed stuff. Sometimes when you're building soil lifts on a river, on a really gravelly lake, you get terrible substrate. Nothing's going to grow through that very well. So you might have to augment it with some soil, in which case you got to be really conscious of what sort of nutrient loading you might result if you're just throwing a bunch of compost at a soil lift. So I know Holly's got a little bit of information about how she blended soils to prevent any sort of nutrient leaching, but provide adequate substrate and media for plants to grow. So take the time to really understand the soil profile. Take the time to understand ice. Ice is a really intimidating thing, especially when you're dealing with a wide lake that could have a lot of wind and waves that you can almost surf. So you really got to be careful about creating that stone toe that's at the adequate height to avoid the most abrasive ice push and wave action, and then building your bioengineering practices in a manner that they will be evolving away from those erosion control materials and becoming naturally stable and resilient with woody vegetation. And that's all I've got. So I think we have a few minutes for questions before we hand it off to Holly.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Patrick. We have one question in the chat right now. I think this is in reference to the video that you showed. It says, looks like the cuttings go in during growing rather than dormant season. I've done the same with reasonable success, having been warned it wouldn't work. What was your survival rate?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. What drives me nuts is that we can't work in the river after October 1st, and willows don't go dormant before October 1st. So we do a couple things to mitigate that. First thing is we cut. When we cut and collect, they go right in the water. You can sit them in the water for a week while you're waiting to install them, and they will continue to have a high survival rate. We don't leave a lot of green on the shoots that are exposed to the air. You can kind of force willows dormant through shock by trimming them back a lot, and they'll just kind of go into reserve mode, and you will have a high success rate in the following spring if you're leaving less exposed to the air for them to transpire and just dry out. Other things, that site that I showed you to start with, those soils were perfect for midsummer. It was September. It was Labor Day, so we're in early September. But those soils were perfect for not ideal conditions. They held water. They were really fine. You could smear them around and really fill in the voids well. The willows came from 200 yards away, so they're obviously suited to that site. I'd say we had at least 70% survival rate from those cuttings, which is great. You can't expect 100. I also always shoot for like 3 to 5 stems or whips per linear feet of soil lift. And then again, that's each tier, right? So there's a lot of willows that go into these, and even if not all of them survive, you've at least got this rebar, you know, that tensile strength underneath the willow, underneath the lifts, that adds different structural integrity. You know, they're interlaced with each other, they're buried. It's just a little bit more structure and roughness, you know, at that boundary condition on the stream or the lake. So I would just recommend go heavy, prune heavy once they're installed, keep them wet the whole time. If you keep them in the shade, even better. But yeah, we pretty much just keep them half in the water until they go in the ground. So, and don't cut more than you need if you think it's going to be 10 days before they get installed. Other people will buy dormant willows, you know, from somewhere like Intervale. I've done willow collection contracts at large scale in which we've actually rent commercial freezer space from like a beer distributor company, and we would collect the willows when they're dormant, put them in a freezer for until July or something when we're installing them, and then we'd pull them out, kind of acclimate them slowly, and then install them. And so, you know, if you got a big job and you know it's not going to be ideal willow transplant season, think about it.
All right, that was a great answer. We did have a question that Meg has already answered, but just for anyone else who might be interested in knowing where the earth anchors come from and what they're made of, Meg put a link in the chat. I don't know if you want to answer what they're made of.
I think they're aluminum or either aluminum or stainless steel. The wire rope is just what you get at a hardware store, and the wire clamps, and it's important I think it's important to buy the appropriate driving rod. You can do it rebar, but rebar has got that texture on the outside, and so sometimes that will bind with between two rocks, or rebar is kind of crappy, and so it might bend. They make driving rods that are kind of telescopic. You can add one, add two, add three, kind of like tent poles, and they're, you know, cold rolled steel, solid, not hollow. They work pretty well. It adds a couple $100 to your material costs. But if you could pair that with a gas powered pounder like Meg's got, you might really have a great time doing it.
Only if you remember to bring it.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions for Patrick before we move on? I'm not seeing any, so thank you, Patrick. That was great.
Yep.
And Holly, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. I'm working on sharing my screen. Let's see if it works this time. Yeah, thank you, Patrick and Meg, for some great information, a lot to digest. So here to throw you some more information. Can anyone see that yet?
Oh, yeah, we can see it.
Okay, awesome.
It's just not in presenter mode.
Yeah.
There we go. How's that?
It looks the same. Yeah.
The same? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so we can see your slides, but then we can see all of your upcoming slides too.
It's in presenter mode on my end, so
well, it's big enough to see. I mean, if you don't mind us seeing your upcoming slides.
Is that better? Whoa. I don't know what's happening on.
Oh, something's changing, or did change. Yeah, I mean, we can't see your upcoming slides anymore.
Okay. Well, I can't see any of you anymore, so I'll have to just shout out if anything is not going well. But hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. And yeah, just following up on this bioengineering case study panel. Today, I'll be talking mostly about planting approaches for some bioengineering projects that I've done. They're primarily bank regrading and erosion control material projects, mostly with just some coconut coir logs. So anyway, I'll dive right in since our limited time today. So I'm going to present 4 different case studies, actually, and they range in their planting approaches from the one on the left side, number 1, to all the way to number 4. They range in a few different ways. So on the left is like the most minimal disturbance type of bioengineering project and planting using all conservation nursery stock, so all live stakes, bare roots, and seed mixes. And also the cheapest kind of version that is possible to try to speed up the succession of a bank revegetation effort. So that one kind of on the left, more in the couple $1,000s or less range, and then moving over into some more, and that's the more kind of the most wild, naturalistic, I guess, approach.
Holly, we haven't seen your slides change.
Oh.
Yeah,
Okay.
and some people aren't seeing them at all, the whole slide, I guess. So it maybe is better in this view, even though we can see your upcoming slides, because I think people can actually see everything.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, we're on the 4 planting approaches slide.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. We'll just stick with that. Okay. Well, I cannot see you all again, so thank you. Okay, so looking at this range of planting approaches from more cost-effective, more naturalistic, less disturbance on the left side, and then moving down the line into using a slight variety of plant materials, both in like the types of plants. So moving into using some tree and shrub containers as well as seed mixes. Again, some shrub containers, and then on the right side, moving into a little bit more of like a manicured garden type of lakeshore. I mean, you could call it, I blur the lines between a landscape garden and a restoration project. And so still using primarily native plants, a lot of woody shrubs and trees, but you're also looking at a lot more disturbance. I mean, this was all lawn beforehand, so we weren't taking out any natural vegetation, but and also looking at a lot more expensive, more in the 20K plus range, especially when you get into more the stone hardscaping, and looking at using ball and burlap trees and shrub and perennial containers. So kind of a range of planting approaches depending on the client goals, the budget, what needs to be done. The 2 on the right side were retaining wall removals and replacements. The 2 on the left side were a little simpler bank regrades using erosion control blankets and coconut coir logs. And yeah, so I'll kind of dive into each of these, giving you some ideas of what could be possible for your own projects. So a lot of them have to do with regrading the slope. It's from the bioengineering manual. When there's eroding, undercut, scoured lakeshore banks, having to regrade back to create a more gradual slope so as to create the media for which plants can thrive in and to prevent further erosion. A lot of them use a coconut coir roll as like a toe of that slope. And then a lot of them also use a stone toe at the mean water level so that the coconut coir roll is set above the mean water level and all the soils and erosion control materials as well, providing a solid base. This is the first case study. So this was a bit of an experimental one, and we're still kind of seeing how it's doing, but it's shown a lot of improvement. This is a before and after photo. This was some undercutting and eroding of a bank on Lake Champlain due to the spring 2011 flooding as well as Hurricane Irene. And so essentially we just we didn't want to regrade the bank back because there's a lot of healthy, mature trees that would have to get removed in order to do that. And we really didn't want to do that. Another option could be to put in encapsulated soil lifts to build the bank out towards the lake. It's a little bit tricky though, because it's a bit of a steep slope on ledge and shale. So first we just wanted to see if we could do a minimal disturbance. We didn't really regrade this much at all. We just put in the coconut coir roll at the bottom, staked it in, did erosion control blankets, and seeded it and planted a lot of live stakes, bare roots, tree pots and things like that. And it's doing a lot better now. There is, we planted red osier dogwoods, we did some viburnum, serviceberry, some willows. It is a bit of a dry bank, so it can be hard to get the willows to thrive. And then there was also some sumac already on site, which is doing really great and is a great erosion control plant. However, there is still some erosion happening just under where that scouring is happening, under the root mat topsoil at the top of the bank. And so we're considering maybe doing some encapsulated soil lifts. The landowner is interested in that so as to prevent any further erosion, because you can only defy gravity so much here with plant material. And then, so live stakes and fascines, Patrick gave you a lot of great info about that, but using conservation nursery stock, I source a lot from Intervale Conservation Nursery, typically dogwoods, shrub willows, maybe some pussy willow or black willow, the native willow tree of Vermont. And so here's kind of a photo montage of the different phases. So this is the before image. This is with the after installing the erosion control materials and planting. We haven't fully staked in our core logs, so that is still to be done there with the rope and driving them in, which was very hard in shaly rock. This is 1 year later. You can see the seed mix is already kind of taking off with the Rudbeckia there, and dogwoods are coming in, and then this is 5 years. So you can see the coconut core log is kind of coming apart there, but that is intended. They're really not intended to last much more than 5 years. So yeah, if it was up to me, I'd almost just kind of want to see this keep going and see if the trees and shrubs can kind of restabilize this bank with woody roots and everything. But yeah, sometimes if landowners are interested in kind of regrading the bank so there's none of that underhang, that scouring, then encapsulated soil lifts could be a good option too. This is a similar project. I'm going to zip through this because it's pretty much the same of simple, minimal disturbance, adding erosion control materials and live stakes, seeding. We planted this in the fall. We went back in the spring. There was probably about, 50 to 75% survival rate. So we planted a few more live stakes. I haven't been able to go back there yet, but I'm curious how it's all doing now. This is case study number 2. So actually the same property as the case study number 1, but down the bank. We had the opportunity to grade back because there was no mature trees in our way. So this is what it looked before. The project collaborators on this was Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, the Lakewise program, back when I was working with Amy Peacock, and then Gracie Masonry did the excavation and the installation of the stone steps. So after we regraded it back, planted it up with trees and shrubs, and also seeded it with a native meadow grass and flower mix. That one, so again, before, similarly from high floodwaters. This is a section plan showing the before and after. So the regrade back. Planting up that shoulder of the slope with mature trees. We also planted trees all over the slope, and then that's a section showing the stone steps as part of it. This is the planting plan showing trees and shrubs, and as you'll see, like here, you can see there's a lot of trees. This is kind of showing more mature canopies. Right now, it's still mostly in kind of its meadow phase or stage of succession until those trees get a little bit bigger. And let's see, species wise, we did a lot of yellow birch, white and bur oak. It's pretty dry, sandy soils. We did, let's see, some poplar. There was some cottonwood on site, so we planted a few more of those. And black cherry, yeah, some serviceberry. This was regrading the slope. we seeded it first with I think it was a dried amasic meadow mix. I think we sourced, this project was from Ernst Conservation Seeds down in Pennsylvania. We're not, they're not locally native seeds. So I've been using more of the Vermont Wetland Plant Supply, the Green Mountain native seed mixes out of Orwell, Vermont. They have some great locally native seed mixes with grasses and native flowers, goldenrod, asters, yeah, a bunch of different good stuff, switchgrass. And then, so after the erosion control materials, so this is kind of one of those hybrid plantings of restoration slash, landscaping for a client who's willing to pay a little bit more to ensure a greater survival rate. These are also planted, container trees and shrubs. And so putting a little bit more time into mulching and watering them to help them survive. These were sourced from Miller Hill Farm in Sudbury, some great native plant material there. And so we would spot compost here, just putting some compost in the holes that we dig to ensure that it doesn't get washed over the slope during rains. And then also putting in mulch rings around the shrubs and trees, allowing for better soil retention, less competition with weeds and the surrounding seed mix, meadow mixes, and then also making it a lot easier to water so that you can fill up the mulch ring and let it soak in. You can see some winterberry, some high bush blueberry in the foreground there. This was the first year, and so a lot of times with the planting approaches, I think about how the natural plant community is going to evolve, or the designed plant community rather. This one, initially is much more of a predominantly a meadow community, and so a lot of native grasses and flowers here. You can see the Monarda, Rudbeckia, but there's a lot of trees interspersed as well. So those, once they get bigger, eventually will shade out a lot of the meadow species, and it'll turn into more of a woodland plant community. This was year 1 in the fall, and then year 5 was just this past summer, and things are looking really good. You can still see those asters and winterberries in there, but a much more full herbaceous plant coverage, which is what we want. Ideally, no bare soil. And if there is bare soil in the beginning of the project, it's either always covered with an erosion control material, blankets or matting, or mulched. Winter, year 4, kind of cool to see the plant coverage in the winter. And then summer, year 5, still going strong, and everything's doing really well. There was definitely a little bit, the weed pressure is always the hardest in the first or second growing season, first 2 years of the project. And so a little bit of added maintenance goes a long way with weeding out a lot of the stuff that, will just, any disturbance in the landscape, bare soil will invite all those super aggressive and those weed seeds that are just on the wind. They can also come in on compost. But I mean, hopefully not, but it does happen. So yeah, that's also, I want to be careful where you're sourcing your compost, making sure it's getting up to the temps it needs to kill off pathogens and weed seeds. But anyway, a lot of maintenance in the first couple of years can go a long way for allowing the plants that you seeded and the native species that you want to grow to take off. Because they can just be a little bit slower to the punch than the non-native, naturalized, and native weeds that you may not want to take over. Or maybe you do, and that's great, because plant volunteers are fun too. All right, so case study 3, per the project, this just required a little bit more disturbance because we had to remove the retaining wall. This was a project Emily Finnegan spearheaded out of Caledonia County NRCD, also in collaboration with Meg, the Northwoods Stewardship Center. Riley Auger was the excavator, did a great job, Auger Heights Excavating. So we had to remove the retaining wall, and we regraded the slope, put in a stone toe to renaturalize the shoreland, essentially trying to mimic the shoreland that's on either side, which is a rocky, wooded shoreland. However, we're also collaborating with a client who wants to maintain their views. They already have a lot of naturalized shoreland. This was kind of like their one lake access area, and it was lawn before this. So we planted just shrubs here that can also, so that they can maintain their view into the lake, so that trees won't get too tall here. And there's some, yeah, I'll skip through because I've got lots of photos. So this is before photos. This is a really old retaining wall. You know, you could keep using it for a while, but there is also a lot of sinkholes starting to happen and erosion underneath that you can't see. So there's some like holes right through the lawn or right at the back end of that concrete. And there's also cedar already growing up through the old post holes. And so, you know, left to its own devices, the plants would probably eventually take over. But retaining walls are not good for aquatic habitat. Like turtles can't traverse this. Frogs, it's doesn't provide any shade for the shallow water. And so we want to try to renaturalize this area while still allowing lake access. They had their dock right here. So this is the before existing conditions plan. I'm just going to zip through since we are almost just have it's about 10 minutes left. This is the conceptual plan, the erosion, the regrade of the slope, putting in a stone toe, erosion control materials, and then minimum 15-foot wide native buffer. That's the minimum you need for the Lake-Wise Award. And I would say that's like absolute minimum for shoreland stability. Ideally, you're really wanting 35 to 50 feet of naturalized vegetated buffer. However, given the character of our lake shores, it's very dense, and there's usually, and camps were built, you know, right along the lake. So oftentimes you don't have a lot of wiggle room to work with. This is the planting plan. We transplanted some of the cedars there. We planted some red osier dogwood, some low bush honeysuckle, which I really love. They can do well in like more shallow rocky soils, drier conditions. We use a native spirea, the Spirea tomentosa, the steeple bush, and then some elderberry, yeah, high bush blueberry. This is the process here. So removing the retaining wall, that's what was left underneath, and then putting in some non-woven geotextile filter fabric. This is to prevent soil from washing behind the stone toe through the stones and into the lake. And it also kind of prevents the stone toe from just getting smushed into the bank, especially these were very wet, kind of very moist, kind of clayey, silty soils. And so it just gives that little extra barrier between the stone toe and the regraded bank. Installing the stone toe, kind of like a burrito where we put rock down. This was washed 12-inch minus erosion stone. Luckily, the quarry it was coming from had some bigger chunks of rock too. Ideally, you get like a few rocks of, 2 to 3 feet wide, if not more, for anchors, a little bit more stability. Then we folded the filter fabric over. Luckily, there was a good pile of on-site rounded rock that we put on top for a little bit more of a naturalistic look, so that it's not all that same color angular stone. And then putting in the erosion control matting, digging a little trench for the coconut coir rolls, staking that all in, setting the plants. And then we also seeded this with clover. And I think a sedge, or no, not sedge, fescue lawn mix. So like creeping fescues, fine fescues, sheep fescues, the creeping red fescue, all good kind of low growing native fescue seed mixes, and some red clover for nitrogen fixing. They also take off super quickly, so they're a great way to just get some quick green coverage on the ground. This was after planting. It's already filling out a little bit with the blueberries, low bush, honeysuckle, dogwood. All right, last case study. I'll try to make this quick. This is the one that's, much bigger budget, a little bit more disturbance because we had to take out this old retaining wall. And yeah, this was a kind of a special case in terms of like shoreland permitting, is that they, it's lawn. They didn't really have, there was one red maple tree that was growing into the retaining wall. So we did get a shoreline protection permit. Of course, we had to get a lake encroachment permit, which we did on that last project as well. And then, but no other native vegetation, only invasives, like the invasive honeysuckle,